Vincent Holloway didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Agnes Whitlock's boarding room like he owned it, because in every way that mattered to a man like him, he believed he did. She was sitting at the small writing desk near the window, pen in hand, a half-finished letter in front of her. She looked up. He saw her go still. "Found you," he said. He crossed the room in 4 steps and swept everything off the desk. The letter, the inkwell, the small photograph of her late husband, all of it crashing to the floor. Then he leaned down until his face was level with hers. "You thought you could just disappear? Take what belongs to me and vanish like smoke?" Agnes didn't flinch. That was the thing about her. She had learned through years of surviving men like Vincent Holloway that flinching only made them feel powerful. "I took nothing that was yours," she said quietly. He smiled. That slow, patient smile that meant he had already won something she didn't know she'd lost yet. "You will regret every mile you ran," he told her. "I promise you that." If this story already has your heart racing, you're not alone. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next. Stories like Agnes's don't wait for anyone. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Red Pine Crossing train station was not a place people chose to linger. It sat at the edge of the Montana Territory, like something forgotten, a rough plank platform roofed with corrugated tin that rattled in the wind, 2 wooden benches worn smooth by years of travelers who were always passing through and never staying. The station master's booth was painted the color of old mustard, and the paint was peeling. In autumn, when the wind came down off the high ridges, it hit the platform sideways, and it didn't care who was standing there. Cole Ashcroft had been standing there for 40 minutes. He was not a man who complained about waiting. He had learned patience the way most men on the frontier learned things. Through necessity, through repetition, through enough years of doing the same hard work in the same unforgiving country that impatience started to seem like a luxury he couldn't afford. He was 42 years old, lean in the way that men who worked outdoors went lean after 30. Not skinny, but stripped down to what was essential. He wore his hat pulled low and his coat open despite the cold because cold didn't bother him much anymore either. He was waiting for freight. The twice-monthly supply train brought dried goods, wire fencing, and seed stock from the Eastern Depot in Billings, and Cole needed all of it before the first hard freeze settled in and made the high pasture road impassable. He had a list in his coat pocket, written in his own spare handwriting, and he had already gone over it twice while he waited. He was going over it a 3rd time when he heard the station master call out the final departure notice and watched the last of the afternoon passengers collect their bags and move off the platform in a loose, unhurried stream. Families. A couple of traveling salesmen. A young man in new boots who looked like he'd never been farther west than St. Louis in his life. They trickled away toward the main street, toward the livery, toward whatever destinations had brought them here. Cole folded his list back into his pocket. That was when he saw her. She was sitting on the 2nd bench, the one closer to the far end of the platform, away from the station master's window. She had a single traveling trunk beside her feet and a worn leather satchel across her lap, and she was sitting very straight, in the way that people sat straight when they were too tired to sit any other way, and too proud to let it show. Her hair was silver-streaked auburn, pinned up under a dark green bonnet that had seen better years. Her coat was clean but thin for this kind of weather. Her gloved hands were folded over the satchel in her lap. She wasn't going anywhere. Every other passenger had left. The platform was empty except for Cole and this woman, and she showed no sign of moving. He watched her for a moment. She hadn't looked at him. She was looking straight ahead at the empty tracks where the train had already gone, like she was waiting for it to come back. Cole walked over to the station master's window. Walter Briggs had been running the Red Pine Crossing station for 11 years. He was a round-faced man with a gray beard and the particular kind of cheerfulness that belonged to people who spent most of their lives in small enclosed spaces. He was already closing the freight ledger when Cole knocked on the frame. "My supplies make it?" Cole asked. "Most of them. Wire fencing's delayed another 2 weeks, sorry to say. Everything else is in the back." Walter glanced past him toward the far bench. His expression shifted just slightly, barely enough to notice, but Cole noticed. "You see that woman out there?" Cole turned halfway. "Hard to miss her. She get left behind? That's one way to put it. Walter set the ledger down and lowered his voice, though there was nobody within 30 feet to hear him. She came off the noon train, said she had a letter, said she was expected. He paused. Said she was here to marry you. Cole was quiet for a long moment. To marry me, he said. That's what she said. I don't know that woman, Walter. I didn't figure you did. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. She had a letter, your name on it, neat as anything. Said she'd been corresponding with you for 3 months through some agency back east. Said you'd asked her to come. I have never in my life contacted any marriage agency. No, Walter said. I know that. Cole looked out at the woman on the bench again. She still hadn't moved. She was still sitting straight, still looking at the empty tracks, and there was something in that posture that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't grief, exactly, and it wasn't anger. It was something quieter and harder than both of those things. How long has she been sitting there? Cole asked. Going on 4 hours. Has she eaten anything? Not that I've seen. Cole was quiet again. She asked you what she should do? He said. She asked me if there was a hotel in town. Walter paused again. I told her the Decker house had rooms. She thanked me very politely, and then she sat back down and she hasn't moved since. I think... He stopped. What? I think she doesn't have enough money for the room. Cole looked at the woman on the bench for another long moment. Then he picked up his hat, which he'd set on the counter ledge, and put it back on. Get my freight loaded to the wagon, he said. I'll be back in a few minutes. He crossed the platform. She heard him coming. He saw her posture shift slightly, a small adjustment, like a person bracing themselves for something, but she didn't look at him until he stopped in front of her. When she did look up, he had the impression of dark eyes that were more tired than afraid, and a face that had probably been quite striking 20 years ago and had weathered into something more interesting since. Ma'am, he said. Mr. Ashcroft, she said. Her voice was steady and quiet, with a faint Eastern accent he couldn't place exactly. I imagine this is not what you expected. No, he said honestly. It isn't. Mind if I sit? She gestured toward the bench with one gloved hand. He sat, not too close, and rested his forearms on his knees. I'm told you have a letter. I do. She opened the satchel in her lap and produced a folded envelope, which she held out to him. I understand if you don't believe what's written in it. I'm not entirely sure what to believe myself at this point. He took the envelope and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Not his hand, but close enough that someone who didn't know his writing might not question it. It was warm in tone, specific in its descriptions of the ranch and the land and what life there looked like. It was the kind of letter that would have made a woman feel safe. He read the whole thing without comment. Then he folded it back up and held it. I didn't write this, he said. I know that now, she said. Not angrily, just tiredly. How do you know it now? She turned to look at him, and for just a moment the composure slipped enough that he could see the exhaustion underneath. Because the man who wrote this letter, according to what's written here, was warm and eager and looking forward to my arrival. She paused. You are clearly none of those things. He almost laughed. It surprised him. That's fair, he said. I'm not asking you for anything, Mr. Ashcroft, she said. I want you to know that. I understand the situation I'm in. I understand what this must look like from your perspective, and I understand that you owe me absolutely nothing. I'm simply trying to decide what the most practical next step is. And what are you thinking the most practical next step might be? She was quiet for a moment. I haven't determined that yet. Cole looked at the letter in his hands again, then at her. Where did you come from? Ohio. Originally? She paused. More recently, Pittsburgh. You crossed half the country based on this letter. I did. How much do you have left? She didn't answer right away. That told him something. Enough to get somewhere, she said carefully. I haven't decided where. He looked out at the empty track. The sun was already dropping fast, the way it did in October this far north, and the temperature was dropping with it. He thought about the freight waiting in the back of the station, and the drive back up to the ranch, and the empty bunkhouse kitchen, and the winter coming. You have a name, he said. Agnes Whitlock. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, I'm going to ask you something direct, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. All right. Are you in trouble? Besides this? The question seemed to land somewhere. She looked at him for a moment like she was measuring something, deciding something, and then she looked back at the track. Not immediately, she said. That was not a no, and they both knew it. Cole stood up. I'm going to get my wagon loaded. When I come back around to the front, I'd like you to come with me. She looked up at him sharply. I beg your pardon? My ranch is about 6 miles north. The cook's been gone 3 weeks, and my hands are eating things that would make a strong man weep. He kept his voice neutral, practical, the same tone he used when he was making any decision about the ranch that needed to be made. You can have the room off the kitchen. It's small, but it's warm and it locks from the inside. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. She stared at him. Mr. Ashcroft, you don't know me. No, he said. I don't. I could be anyone. You could, he agreed, but you've been sitting on this bench for 4 hours in 40-degree weather, and you didn't spend your last money on a room, which tells me you're not foolish, just unlucky. And you haven't cried once since I sat down, which tells me you're not the kind of person who uses tears to get what she wants. He looked at her steadily. In my experience, those are better signs of a person's character than a letter of introduction. Agnes Whitlock looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, picked up her satchel, and straightened her coat. The trunk is too heavy for me to carry alone, she said. I'll get it, he said. They walked to the front of the station together, and that was where it happened. 3 men from town were coming off the main street, Jack Feeney and 2 of the Dunbar brothers, who worked at the mill and spent most of their evenings finding other people's business more interesting than their own. They saw Cole coming around with Agnes at his side and the trunk in his grip, and Feeney let out a short laugh that he didn't bother to disguise. Cole Ashcroft, Feeney said. Don't tell me that's your mail-order bride. Cole kept walking. Lord Almighty, one of the Dunbar brothers said, and he wasn't being reverent. She's old enough to be his mother. Maybe he likes the experienced type, the other one said, and both of them laughed. Cole stopped. He set the trunk down slowly. He turned around, and he looked at the 3 men with the particular kind of calm that people who have been very angry for a long time develop. Not hot anger, not the kind that flares and burns out, but the cold kind that sits in the chest and doesn't move. Something funny? He said. Feeney shrugged, still smiling. Come on, Cole. A man your age, you can do better than... Finish that sentence, Cole said, and we're going to have a very different kind of conversation. Feeney's smile didn't entirely disappear, but it got smaller. She's a guest at my ranch, Cole said. He picked the trunk back up. And she'll be treated like one, by everyone in this town. Are we clear on that? Nobody said anything. Cole turned back around, and Agnes was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than either of those. Thank you, she said, quietly enough that the men behind them couldn't hear. Don't mention it, he said. They loaded the wagon without speaking much more. Cole threw a blanket over the trunk to keep it from shifting, and he helped Agnes up onto the wagon seat without being asked, and they pulled out of Red Pine Crossing as the last of the light went flat and gray behind the ridgeline to the west. They drove for a while in silence. Agnes sat with her satchel in her lap and her hands folded over it, watching the road ahead. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. With those men. I know, he said. I've been managing worse than that for a long time. I imagine you have, he said. That doesn't make it right. She was quiet again. Then, why are you doing this, honestly? He thought about it. He was not a man who gave dishonest answers just because honest ones were uncomfortable, but he wanted to get it right. Because someone put you in a bad situation, he said. And whatever the reason for that, you don't deserve to be left on a bench in the cold because of it. You're taking a stranger into your home. I've taken in strays before. Agnes turned to look at him. I am not a stray. No, he said. That came out wrong. I'm sorry. She looked back at the road. I have been called worse. What's the worst? She seemed surprised by the question. Then, to his further surprise, she almost smiled. Just the edge of it, just for a second. "A scheming widow," she said. "A fraudulent woman. A thief." "And were you?" "No." He nodded. "All right. You believe me?" She turned to look at him again, and this time there was something different in her face. Not the controlled composure, but the thing underneath it, the version of her that wasn't performing resilience. "I don't know you well enough to believe or disbelieve you," he said. "I'm just taking you at your word until I have a reason not to. Most people don't extend that courtesy." "Most people haven't met you yet," he said. "Give them time. They'll sort out their opinions on their own." She turned back to the road, and when she spoke again, her voice was a little quieter. "I didn't come here to be a burden to you." "You're not a burden yet," he said. "Ask me again in a week." This time she did smile, small and brief and real, and Cole looked back at the road ahead and didn't say anything else. The ranch came into view about 20 minutes later, the main house and barn visible against the darkening ridgeline, the windows lit with the faint yellow light of oil lamps. Agnes looked at it without saying anything, taking it in, the working plainness of it, the mended fence line, the scatter of outbuildings that spoke to a place that was functional rather than comfortable. Cole brought the wagon up close to the house and climbed down. 3 of the ranch hands came out of the bunkhouse to help with the freight, and they stopped when they saw Agnes sitting on the wagon seat. Martinez, the senior hand, a compact man in his mid-50s with a dark mustache and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of their life in outdoor light, looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him. "Mrs. Whitlock is going to be staying in the room off the kitchen for a while. Get it cleaned up tonight. Somebody bring in more wood for that stove." Martinez held his look for a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Cole helped Agnes down from the wagon, and she stood in the yard for a moment looking at the house. Up close, she could see that the porch boards needed replacing, and the shutters on the left window had lost 2 of their hinges. She didn't say anything about it. Inside, the main room was large and functional. A long wooden table, chairs, a stone fireplace that needed cleaning, shelves that had been organized by someone who had given up partway through. The kitchen was through a doorway to the left, and through another door off the kitchen was the room Cole had mentioned. Small, as he'd said, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the barn. Agnes set her satchel on the washstand and stood in the middle of the room. "It's warm," she said. "The kitchen stove runs all night and fall," Cole said from the doorway. He didn't come in. "There's water in the pitcher. Supper's been eaten already, but there should be bread and something in the larder if you're hungry." "Thank you," she said. He started to turn away, then stopped. "I'll ask around in the morning about the letter. Find out who wrote it." "You don't have to do that on my account." "I'm doing it on my own account," he said. "Someone used my name without my permission. I'd like to know who." She looked at him. "And if it turns out to be something more complicated than a simple mistake?" He met her eyes. "Then it turns out to be something more complicated," he said. "We'll deal with that when we get to it." He said goodnight and pulled the door closed behind him, and Agnes stood alone in the small, warm room listening to the sound of the wind outside, and the distant low of cattle somewhere on the dark hillside, and the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't hers. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She was 57 years old. She had buried a husband, lost a home, spent the last of what she had on a ticket west based on a letter she now knew was forged. She was in a stranger's house in a territory she had never seen before, dependent on the kindness of a man who owed her nothing and had every reason to leave her on that bench. She reached into her satchel and found the small photograph that she always carried, her late husband, Thomas, on their wedding day, young and a little awkward in a collar that was clearly too stiff. She held it for a moment. Then she put it away, lay down on the bed fully clothed, and pulled the blanket up. She did not cry. In the main room, Cole sat at the long table with a cup of cold coffee and the forged letter open in front of him. He read it again, more slowly this time, looking for something in the handwriting, the phrasing, the particular way the sentences were built, that might tell him who had written it. He had a suspicion, and the suspicion made him feel something he hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly. Not yet. More like a door opening somewhere that he hadn't known was closed. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and hit the house broadside, And somewhere on the porch, a loose board rattled, and Cole sat at the table for a long time after the lamp burned low, listening to a house that hadn't sounded like this. Inhabited, populated, something more than just walls keeping out the cold, and longer than he wanted to admit. He stood up eventually. He turned the lamp down. He went to bed. The next morning, Agnes Whitlock was up before dawn. Cole came through the kitchen just after 5, still pulling on his coat, and stopped in the doorway. The stove was lit. Coffee was already made. On the table were biscuits, 4 of them, golden and even, still warm from the oven. There was a small pot of something on the back burner that smelled like salt pork and onion. Agnes was standing at the wash basin with her back to him, rinsing a pan. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, without turning around. "I don't do things because I have to." He poured a cup of coffee and stood at the table. He picked up one of the biscuits. "These are good," he said. "I know those are good too," she said, and there was something dry in her voice that made him look up. She was still facing away from him, but he could hear the almost smile in it. He sat down at the table. "Sleep all right?" he said. "Well enough." She turned from the wash basin and wiped her hands on a cloth. In the morning light, she looked less worn than she had on the bench at the station, or maybe he was just getting used to her face. "Your larder is a catastrophe," she said. "Whoever was cooking before me was working with almost nothing." "He quit in August," Cole said. "We've been getting by." "Getting by," she repeated, and her tone left very little question about what she thought of that. Martinez appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 of the other hands behind him. Dillard, who was 23 and had hair that refused to sit flat, and an older man named Foss, who communicated mostly in nods. They saw Agnes. They saw the biscuits. Dillard's face did something almost involuntary. "Ma'am," Martinez said. "Sit down," Agnes said, and it wasn't a warm invitation so much as an instruction. "There's enough for everyone." They sat. Cole watched them eat and watched Agnes moving around the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of work for decades. Not rushing, not performing, just doing the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that. She didn't talk much while she worked. She answered questions directly and without embellishment. When Foss, who had not said 5 words to any living person all week, pushed his empty plate back and said, "Best biscuit I've had since Cheyenne," she looked at him with an expression that was almost warm. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "Meant it as one," he said, and went back to his coffee. After breakfast, Cole rode into town alone. He found Walter Briggs at the station opening the freight office for the morning, and he walked in and closed the door behind him and stood in the middle of the room and waited until Walter turned around. Walter turned around. He saw Cole's face. His own face did something complicated. "Cole," he said. "How long did you think I wouldn't figure it out?" Cole said. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about Cole when he was genuinely angry. He got quieter, not louder. Walter set down the papers he was holding. "I don't know what you're "The letter," Cole said. "I've looked at it 3 times now. The handwriting's not mine, but someone wrote it who knew how I phrase things, who knew details about the ranch that aren't public, who knew I preferred a direct woman to a sentimental one." He paused. "You're the only person I've talked to in the last 2 years who fits all 3 of those." Walter was quiet. "Why?" Cole said. Walter sat down heavily on the stool behind his counter. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, he didn't look at Cole. "You've been alone up on that hill for 19 years, he said. "Since Martha. You don't go to town unless you need supplies. You don't talk to people unless you have to. You've got 4 ranch hands and a dog, and you've been eating bad meals for 3 weeks because you couldn't bring yourself to hire someone new. You know what you said to me last April when I asked you if you were all right? Walter, you said fine. That's all you said. Fine." He finally looked up. "You've been saying fine for 19 years, Cole, and I've been watching you disappear 1 inch at a time." The room was quiet. "She lost everything," Walter said. "Husband died 5 years back, left debts she didn't know about. Someone came in and took what was left. She had nothing and nowhere to go. I read about her situation through a church contact in Pittsburgh. She was looking for a new start, and you—" He stopped. "You needed something too, even if you'd rather drown than admit it." Cole looked at him for a long time. "You forged my name on a letter," he said. Yes, Walter said. You sent a woman across the country under false pretenses. Yes? She could have been harmed. She could have been left stranded by a man less patient than me. I know, Walter said, and his voice was flat with the weight of it. I know. I've been sick about it since the day I sent it. I knew it was wrong. I told myself it was right, because the outcome would be right, and that was stupid, and it was wrong, and I'm sorry. Cole was quiet. She's staying at the ranch, he said finally. Walter looked up. She is? For now. Cole moved toward the door. You're going to tell her what you did, not me. You. Cole, she deserves to hear it from the person who did it. He put his hand on the door. And Walter, if this goes badly, if she's hurt by any of this, if it turns out she's got problems following her that your scheme made worse, I will hold you to account for it. You understand me? Walter nodded slowly. I understand. Cole went out, and the morning was cold and flat and pale, and he stood on the platform for a moment looking at the empty track, and he thought about Agnes Whitlock sitting up in the kitchen before dawn, making biscuits she didn't have to make for people she didn't know, because that was apparently just who she was. He thought about what Walter had said. 19 years. He got back on his horse and rode north. When he came back over the ridge in the late morning, he could see smoke from the kitchen chimney, and the sound of someone moving around the yard reached him before he got to the fence. Agnes was hanging washing on a line strung between two posts near the bunkhouse, the hands shirts and socks, from the look of it. Dillard was watching her from a careful distance with the expression of a man who wasn't sure if he should offer to help or if offering would cause some kind of offense. Cole dismounted and walked over. Agnes didn't stop what she was doing. How was town? She said. Informative, he said. I know who wrote the letter. Her hand stilled on the line. Who? She said. Walter Briggs, the station master. He's an old friend. Cole kept his voice even. He did it without my knowledge or consent. He thought. He stopped, started again. He thought he was helping both of us. He was wrong to do it, and he knows that. Agnes stood very still. She was holding one of Martinez's shirts halfway pinned to the line, and she just stood there holding it. Did he know anything about me? She said. Specifically about me? He said he'd heard about your situation through a contact back east. He said you'd lost everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached up and pinned the shirt to the line with 2 precise movements and reached for the next item in the basket. I should be angry, she said. You're allowed to be angry. I know I'm allowed. She pinned another shirt. I've just spent so much energy on anger in the last 5 years that I'm not sure I have enough left to spend on a well-meaning old man who made a very poor decision. Cole watched her work for a moment. He's going to come out here and tell you himself. He owes you that. He doesn't owe me anything, she said, but I'll hear him out. The wind came through and the shirts on the line lifted and settled, and Agnes reached for the last item in the basket, and Cole stood there watching her and felt something shift somewhere in the architecture of the morning. Something small and unremarked, like a door he'd thought was stuck moving just slightly on its hinge. The fence on the east pasture, he said. 3 posts are down. I was going to get to it this week. Agnes glanced at him sideways. I'm not telling you to fix it, he said. I'm just... He stopped. Making conversation, she said. Trying to, he said. She almost smiled. The bunkhouse stovepipe is loose, she said. I noticed it this morning. If it isn't secured before the first snow, it will come off in the wind and you'll have 4 very cold ranch hands. I'll see to it, he said. And your larder needs restocking before the end of the week. I made a list. Of course you did. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's not a problem at all. They stood in the yard in the thin October sun, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And the shirts dried on the line, and somewhere on the east pasture 3 fence posts waited to be fixed. And it was an ordinary morning on an ordinary ranch, except that something had happened in the last 18 hours that had quietly and permanently altered the landscape of it. Neither of them would have been able to say exactly what, if someone had asked them. But it had happened, and it was not going back. Walter Briggs came out to the ranch on a Thursday. He drove himself in the small station buggy, which he almost never did. Walter was a man who preferred to stay within the boundaries of the things he managed, and the station was his boundary. And he came up the road in the mid-morning with his hat in his lap instead of on his head, which told Cole everything about the state of the man's conscience before he'd even climbed down from the seat. Cole was on the porch when he arrived. He watched Walter tie the horse to the post and stand in the yard for a moment, looking at the house with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a speech and is now not sure any part of it will hold up. "She's in the kitchen," Cole said. Walter nodded. He went up the porch steps, and Cole moved aside to let him pass, and that was all Cole did, moved aside. This was not his conversation to manage. Agnes was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand, working on something that looked like an inventory. She heard boots on the kitchen floor and looked up, and her eyes went to Walter, and her face went through something careful and controlled that arrived at neutral. "Mr. Briggs," she said. Walter stopped in the middle of the kitchen. He was holding his hat with both hands and turning it slowly by the brim, which was what men did when they were nervous and didn't know what to do with their hands. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I owe you an explanation and an apology, and I want to be clear that those are two different things. One doesn't cover the other." Agnes set down the pencil. She folded her hands on the table. She did not invite him to sit, and she did not speak. Walter took a breath. He told her what he'd told Cole, but more of it. The contact in Pittsburgh, a woman he'd known through his late wife, who had written to him about Agnes's situation 3 months ago. How he'd heard about the husband's debts, the inheritance stripped away through schemes Agnes hadn't even fully understood until the damage was done. The way she'd spent the last years working whatever work was available and watching each option close one by one. How he'd thought about Cole, up on the ridge, going quiet year by year, and how he'd thought, and here his voice went a little rough, and he pressed on through it, how he'd thought that two people in that particular kind of loneliness might be exactly what the other needed. "So I wrote the letter," he said. "I used Cole's name because I knew you wouldn't come for a stranger's. I described the ranch because I wanted it to feel real to you, and I told myself it was a kind thing." He stopped. "It wasn't a kind thing. It was a deceptive thing that I dressed up in kindness to make myself feel better about doing it." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Did your Pittsburgh contact know what you were planning?" she said. "No, she only told me about your situation because she was worried about you. She didn't know I'd use it the way I did." "And if Cole had been a different kind of man," Agnes said, "if he'd met me at that station and turned me away, or worse, what then?" Walter's jaw tightened. "I thought I knew him well enough." "You gambled my safety on what you thought you knew," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did. And I was wrong." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone was working near the barn, the sound of a hammer on wood, steady and unhurried. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," Agnes said. "It isn't all right. What you did put me in a situation where I had no ground to stand on and no way back. And I've spent the last 2 years of my life in situations exactly like that, and I'm very tired of them." Walter nodded. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was just taking it. "But I'm also not going to tell you that your intentions were evil," she said. "I've met evil intentions up close, and they don't look like you. They look like something else entirely." Something moved across her face. "So I'll accept your apology, Mr. Briggs. I won't tell you it didn't matter because it did, but I'll accept it." Walter let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for a week. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. She picked her pencil back up. "Thank the fact that Cole Ashcroft is a decent man, because that's the only reason this ends with an apology instead of something a great deal worse." Walter left shortly after. Cole saw him to his buggy, and they stood in the yard for a moment, and Walter said, "She's something," in a voice that was equal parts admission and wonder. "She is," Cole said. "You going to be all right with her here?" Cole looked back at the house. "She reorganized the entire larder yesterday. relabeled everything, found 2 bags of flour we didn't know we had. Dillard called it a miracle. I wasn't asking about the larder. Cole looked at him. Go back to your station, Walter. Walter went back to his station. Inside, Agnes had gone back to her inventory, which turned out to be a complete accounting of everything in the kitchen and adjacent storeroom. What was there, what was nearly gone, what was missing entirely, and what she'd need from town by the end of the week to keep a working kitchen running through the first month. She left it on the table where Cole would find it, and by the time he came back inside, she was already in the yard talking to Martinez about the schedule for the next few days. Cole found the list. He read it twice. It was thorough, exact, and annotated with small notes in the margin where she'd flagged things that could be substituted if the preferred item wasn't available. He stood in the kitchen holding it and thinking that his last cook, a young man named Petrie, who had been entirely pleasant and entirely unreliable, had never once made a list of anything. He put it in his pocket to take to town. That afternoon, Dillard knocked on the kitchen door and asked Agnes if she knew anything about sewing, because the seam on his good shirt had gone and he had no way to fix it. Agnes told him to bring her the shirt. She mended it in under 10 minutes while he stood there watching with the expression of someone witnessing something faintly miraculous. My mother used to do that, he said. Your mother learned it from someone who learned it from someone, Agnes said, tying off the thread. There's nothing miraculous about it. It's just practice. You don't have to do this stuff, Dillard said. Cole said you're a guest. I am a guest, Agnes said. She handed him the shirt. I'm also a person who is accustomed to being useful, and I find sitting still for long periods of time extremely irritating. She looked at him. Is there anything else that needs mending while I have the needle out? There was. Dillard went and got Foss and Martinez, and the 3 of them produced a collective pile of torn clothing that Agnes worked through with steady efficiency over the next hour, listening to them talk around the kitchen table with the particular ease that men fell into when a woman was present who didn't seem to require any performance from them. She learned things about the ranch, the east pasture fence that had been down since a windstorm in September, the roof over the smaller barn that leaked when it rained from the northeast, the cattle that had wandered 3 times in the last month because the gate latch on the upper field needed replacing. She learned that Martinez had been with Cole for 11 years and was the only one of the hands who'd known Cole before his wife died. She learned that Dillard had come up from Colorado looking for steady work and found it, mostly, except for the food situation, which had gotten bad after Petrie left. She learned that Foss had been in Red Pine Crossing for 6 years and had no particular interest in going anywhere else, which Dillard said was either wisdom or stubbornness, depending on the day. She also learned in the way women learn things, sideways through the gaps in what men say rather than the things they say directly, that Cole Ashcroft had been liked in this territory for a long time and trusted, and that his gradual withdrawal from town life had been noted by people who missed his presence, even if they'd never told him so. He used to come to the dances, Martinez said at some point, not looking at her. Back before. He wasn't much of a dancer, but he came. People liked having him around. What changed, Agnes said, though she already had a guess. Martinez was quiet for a moment. His wife passed, 19 years back. He picked up his coffee. He just pulled back, focused on the ranch. You can understand it. I can, Agnes said. Doesn't mean it was good for him, Foss said, which was one of the longer statements she'd heard him make. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Just means it made sense. Agnes finished the last of the mending and folded everything into a neat stack. When does Cole usually come in for supper? She said. He doesn't usually, Dillard said. He eats whenever. Sometimes he forgets. Agnes stood up. He won't forget tonight, she said, in a tone that wasn't a threat exactly, but was adjacent to one. Cole did not forget. He came in at 6 and found the table set, not elaborately, but properly, the way tables were set when someone thought the people sitting down to them were worth the small effort of a placed fork and a folded cloth. Agnes put a pot of beef stew on the table and a plate of cornbread beside it and sat down at the far end with her own bowl. Cole sat down. Martinez, Dillard, and Foss filed in behind him and took their usual seats, and for a moment nobody said anything because the stew smelled like something that required a pause before you just went ahead and ate it. Mrs. Whitlock, Martinez said, with a gravity that was only slightly undermined by the speed with which he then served himself. Agnes ate quietly. She listened more than she talked. But when Dillard said something about the east pasture fence, complaining that the post holes were freezing at night now and making the repair harder, Agnes said, without looking up from her bowl, "If you drive the post before noon, the ground is still soft enough from the morning thaw. You lose about 2 hours of work window, but the posts will set better." Dillard blinked. "How do you know that?" "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," Agnes said. "I've set a fence post or two." "You did fence work?" Dillard said. "I did everything," Agnes said simply. "When you grow up where I grew up, you do what needs doing." Cole was looking at her from across the table. She felt it and looked back. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just listening." After supper, Cole stayed at the table with his coffee while the hands went back to the bunkhouse. Agnes cleared the dishes, which she did with the same efficient lack of ceremony she brought to everything, and Cole sat watching her in a way he hadn't planned to. "You don't have to do this," he said. "The cooking, the mending, all of it. I'm not expecting payment." "I know you're not," she said, rinsing a bowl. "I told your Dillard the same thing I'll tell you. I'm not constitutionally capable of doing nothing. It makes me anxious." "How long has it been like that?" She considered the question while she dried her hands. "Since Thomas died. Maybe before that, honestly. When things are uncertain, I work. It's how I stay." She paused, looking for the word. "Anchored." "How long were you married?" Cole said. 22 years. She came to the table with a cup of coffee of her own and sat down, not in her previous spot, but in the chair closer to the corner of the table, which put her at a nearer right angle to Cole. He was a good man, not a practical one, but good. He trusted people who didn't deserve it, and he didn't tell me how bad things had gotten until it was too late to do anything about it. She paused again. "That's the thing I'm still working out, whether I'm angry at him or just sad." "Can you be both?" Cole said. "Apparently," she said. "Yes." The lamp was burning low between them. Outside, the wind had come up again, the particular cold, persistent wind of an October night in the high country. "Your wife," Agnes said. She asked it carefully, like a question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. "Martha, was it?" Cole nodded. "How did she pass?" "Fever," he said. "It came fast. 3 days from sick to gone." He looked at the table. "I wasn't here for the first day of it. I was up on the North Ridge checking on a downed fence." He stopped. "There's always a fence." Agnes looked at him. She didn't offer him anything for that. No comfort, no platitude. And he was grateful for it. "I'm sorry," she said, and it was just the words, plainly, the way people meant them before they got complicated. 19 years, he said. "I should be better at talking about it." "Time doesn't necessarily make things easier to talk about," she said. "Sometimes it just makes the silence more established." He looked at her. "That's accurate." "I have a lot of established silences," she said. She finished her coffee. She stood up. "Good night, Mr. Ashcroft." "Cole," he said. She paused. "Good night, Cole." She went to her room, and he sat at the table in the low light for a while after. And the word, his name, in her voice, which was different from any voice that had spoken it in longer than he wanted to count, sat somewhere in the quiet of the room and didn't go away. The weeks that followed did not transform the ranch. That would be too easy a way to say it, and it wouldn't be true. What happened was slower than transformation and less comfortable than it. More like the way a frozen creek begins to loosen in early spring, the ice not gone but moving, cracked through in places where the water underneath had finally built up enough pressure. Agnes fixed things because she saw them broken. She didn't announce what she'd done or ask for acknowledgement. The torn curtain in the main room reappeared hemmed. The stovepipe in the bunkhouse was secured against the wall with 2 new brackets that she'd found in the tool shed and asked Foss to install, handing him the brackets and the directions with equal efficiency. The kitchen shelves were reorganized and labeled in her precise, slanted handwriting. Not the way Cole had originally arranged them, not the way Petrie had rearranged them into near uselessness, but in the way that made actual sense given how a kitchen worked and what got reached for most often. Dillard had taken to arriving at the kitchen door in the mornings with some question or other that was usually about the ranch, but sometimes wasn't. Agnes answered all of them with the same directness, whether it was where he'd put the harness oil or whether she thought he ought to write to the girl in Colorado he'd left behind when he came north. On the Colorado question, she said, "If you're asking me whether you should write, you already know the answer is yes. You're just looking for someone to tell you it won't go badly." He had written. He'd received a letter back already. Martinez never asked personal questions, and Agnes never offered personal information to him, and they coexisted around the working operations of the ranch with a mutual respect that didn't require conversation to sustain itself. He had initially watched her with the careful assessment of someone who had been in charge of things for a long time and was waiting to see whether a new presence would complicate them. After the first week, his watching changed character. Less assessment, more something that looked like relief. Foss said almost nothing to her. She had decided early on that this was not unfriendliness, but a kind of considered economy, and she treated it accordingly. When she needed to communicate something to him, she said it once and clearly, and he acted on it without discussion. And that was their entire relationship, and it worked. Cole was the complicated one. Not in any way he announced. He was unfailingly decent, practically helpful, and almost entirely closed. He answered questions about the ranch with precision and genuine care for detail. He asked Agnes what she needed and provided it without complaint. He came to meals reliably now. She had noticed that. And he stayed at the table a little longer each time, and they had conversations that were real conversations, not just logistics. And then he went back to wherever he spent his evenings, and the door between them closed again. She was not in love with him. She was clear about that with herself, because she'd learned in recent years to be clear with herself about things she couldn't afford to be wrong about. But she had arrived expecting nothing and found someone more textured, more carefully constructed, and more genuinely worn at the edges than she'd anticipated, and that the unexpectedness of him had lodged somewhere in her attention and wasn't entirely shifting. She was here for 1 month. She'd said it, and she meant it. She reminded herself of this on the morning of the 3rd week, when she was checking the inventory against the list she'd left for Cole, and realized the kitchen was in better shape than it had been when she arrived, and the ranch house smelled like food, and the hands came in every morning with the low-grade contentment of people who were being adequately fed, and the whole thing was working in a way that she should not allow herself to get attached to. She was reminding herself of this when Cole came in for the morning coffee and said, without preamble, "The ranchers' meeting is Thursday in town. Usually I skip it. Martinez thinks I should go." Agnes looked at him over her coffee. "Why do you usually skip it?" "Because it involves a room full of people and a lot of talk that mostly circles back to the same 3 complaints." "And why does Martinez think you should go?" "Apparently there's been talk about water rights on the Eastern Creek. Someone's been altering the runoff upstream, and 2 of the smaller ranches have been short on water since September. Martinez thinks it'll matter to us by spring if it isn't addressed." Agnes set her cup down. "Then you should go." "I know I should go," Cole said. "I just—" He stopped. "You just would rather not," she said. He was quiet. "I'll come with you," she said. She said it before she'd entirely decided to, which was not how she normally operated. And she spent a brief moment examining why she'd said it and whether she wanted to take it back. She did not want to take it back. If that would make it worse, you can tell me." Cole looked at her for a moment. "Why would you come to a rancher's meeting?" "Because you need to go and you don't want to go alone and you won't ask anyone to come with you," she said. "And because if there's a water rights dispute, I might have useful questions, since I spent 6 years helping Thomas manage property claims before the debts went bad." He kept looking at her. "You know property claims?" "I know enough to ask the right questions," she said, "which is usually more useful than knowing everything." He said after a moment, "All right." Thursday came with a thin gray sky and cold that had sharpened overnight into something with real intention behind it. They drove into Red Pine Crossing together in Cole's wagon, which was not a thing that went unnoticed. By the time they tied up at the meeting hall, a wide, low-ceilinged room above the feed store, Cole was aware of the sideways looks, the small calibrations of expression that people made when they were deciding what to make of something. Agnes ignored all of it with the precision of a woman who had long since learned to distinguish between what mattered and what just felt like it did. The meeting was what Cole had described. 8 ranchers, 4 legitimate complaints about the water issue, and the same 3 men who talked for twice as long as their information warranted. The man responsible for the water issue turned out to be a mill owner named Giddings, who had diverted a secondary creek channel in late summer to improve water flow to his property and had not considered or not cared what that did to the properties downstream. Giddings was in the room. He was a thick-necked man in a good coat who had the practiced calm of someone accustomed to being the most financially comfortable person in any given space and finding it a reliable form of protection. He said the diversion was on his property and within his rights, and he had legal documentation to prove it. 3 of the smaller ranchers started talking at once. The man running the meeting, a rancher named Clifton who did his best, raised his hand for quiet. Agnes, who was sitting in the row behind Cole and had not said a word for 40 minutes, leaned forward and said quietly enough that only Cole and the 2 men nearest her could hear, "Ask him if the documentation was filed before or after the creek changed course." Cole looked at her. "Ask him," she said. Cole raised his hand. Clifton nodded to him. "Giddings," Cole said, "was that documentation filed before or after you made the change?" Giddings' calm shifted slightly. Just slightly. "I don't see how the timing is relevant to—" "It's relevant," Agnes said, and now her voice was audible to the room, because if the documentation was filed after the change was made, it was filed in response to a complaint rather than in advance of a planned alteration, which means it wasn't a permitted change. It was a retroactive justification. The room went quiet. Giddings looked at her. "Who is this woman?" "She's with me," Cole said. "She's not a property owner in this territory," Giddings said. "Neither are you, technically," Agnes said. "A mill lease isn't the same as a deed, and a retroactive filing for a water diversion isn't a legal authorization, it's a paperwork cover." She looked at him steadily. "If you'd like to make this a legal matter, I suspect the Territorial Land Office would find the timing rather interesting." The room stayed quiet. Giddings said nothing more about the documentation. The meeting ended with a motion to have the diversion reviewed by the county land assessor, which passed 7-1, and the one vote against was Giddings, who left quickly when it was over. Outside, standing in the cold gray afternoon, one of the smaller ranchers, a man named Platt, who ran a spread southeast of Cole's, stopped Agnes on the steps. "That was well done," he said. "You know land law?" "I know enough of it," she said. "We've needed someone who knows enough of it for a while," he said, and tipped his hat and walked away. Cole was at the wagon. Agnes came down the steps and he helped her up without comment, but when he climbed up on his own side and picked up the reins, he sat for a moment before starting the horses. "You let him know you knew," Cole said, "before he could build a defense." "Yes," she said. "How did you know he hadn't filed in advance?" "I didn't," she said. "I guessed. Men like Giddings don't plan that carefully. They act and then they document." She paused. "I used to watch Thomas do it. Not the diverting creeks part, but the acting and then documenting. It's a recognizable pattern." Cole released the brake and started the horses toward home. "You could have let me ask the question myself," he said. "You would have," she said. "Eventually. I just moved it forward." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure if I should be annoyed or not." "I'll leave that to you," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and they drove north out of town under the gray sky, and the cold had picked up a little, and Agnes pulled her coat tighter, and Cole reached behind the seat without looking and produced a heavy wool blanket that he passed to her, and she took it without comment, and they drove the rest of the way in a silence that had a different quality to it than the silence on the first night, less careful, less provisional, less like 2 people trying not to break something. The 3rd week ended. The 4th began. Agnes did not bring up the 1-month agreement. Neither did Cole. She was aware of this, aware that she was aware of it, and aware that the awareness was something she should probably address directly, and was choosing not to yet. She told herself she was choosing not to yet because the timing wasn't right, and she half believed it. The cattle count needed reconciling. Cole had mentioned it in passing, and Agnes had asked to see the ledger, and he'd looked at her with slight surprise and then brought it out, and she had spent the better part of an afternoon cross-referencing it against the seasonal records and found two discrepancies. One an honest accounting error, one something more interesting. "This column," she said, showing him, "shows 22 head sold to the Billings buyer in August, but the freight receipt shows 20 head. She looked up. "Were 2 head of cattle unaccounted for, or did someone short you on the payment?" Cole looked at the ledger, then at her. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't check the receipt against the count." "You should check the receipt against the count," she said. "I know that," he said, with just a note of dryness that told her he knew she knew that too. "I've been short-staffed and managing a lot alone." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying someone may have taken advantage of the fact that you were short-staffed and managing a lot alone, and they may plan to do it again." Cole was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ledger with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when something had moved under the surface, and he was deciding whether to let it show. "I'll write to the Billings buyer," he said. "I can draft the letter if you like," she said. "I'm familiar with the kind of language that makes people take inventory discrepancies seriously without giving them room to pretend they were clerical errors." He looked at her for a long moment. "How did you get to know this kind of thing?" he said. She set the pencil down. "My husband trusted people," she said. "And I spent 22 years watching what happened when you trusted people without verifying. After he died and the problems started coming in, the debts, the men who claimed he owed them, the ones who said they had agreements he'd made verbally and never written down, I learned very fast how paper works, because paper is the only thing that doesn't remember what it's convenient to remember." Cole nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Draft the letter." She drafted it that evening. It was 3 paragraphs, direct, specific, informed enough in its language that a man receiving it would understand immediately that whoever sent it knew what a fraudulent count looked like and would pursue it. She left it on the table for Cole to read in the morning. He made one change, added his signature where she'd left a line for it, and sent it by the next mail rider. The reply came back in 8 days. The Billings buyer's letter was apologetic, attributed the discrepancy to a loading error, and included a banknote for the difference. Martinez brought the letter in from the mail and put it on the kitchen table where Agnes was working, and read the return address, and said nothing. But when Cole came in for supper that evening, Martinez put the letter in front of him and said, "Well, 8 days," and looked across the table at Agnes and nodded once. Agnes had her eyes on her bowl, but Dillard, who was watching everything with the enthusiasm of someone young enough to find other people's lives genuinely interesting, saw her almost smile. On a Tuesday in the last week, the cold finally committed. It came overnight, and by morning the yard was hard and white, and the water in the horse trough had a skin of ice on it. Agnes stood at the kitchen window in the early gray light and watched her breath fog the glass and thought, not for the first time, but with more weight than before, that she had been here long enough to see the season change. She had come with 1 month's agreement. She was 2 days from the end of it. Cole came in for morning coffee, and she had it ready, and she did not say anything about the calendar, and neither did he. They drank their coffee and talked about the hard freeze and what it would mean for the stock and the road to town, and Dillard came in and said the trough would need breaking 3 times a day now, and Agnes said she'd put a heavier pot on the stove to have hot water ready for it, and it was all ordinary and specific and practical. And when Cole said, at the end of it, as he was pulling on his coat to go out, "We'll need to decide something about the arrangement," he paused with one arm in his sleeve. "Not today, but soon." Agnes looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know we will." He finished putting his coat on. He went out the door. She stood in the kitchen in the first hard cold of winter and listened to the sound of him crossing the frozen yard. And then she went to the stove and put the big pot on for the trough water, because Dillard would need it by mid-morning, and the animals did not care what complicated thing was unresolved between the 2 people on the other side of the barn wall. She had not come here expecting anything. She still did not expect anything. But she had been here long enough to know that the question coming, the one Cole had named and then walked away from this morning, was not going to be as simple as leaving or staying. It was going to be something harder than either of those things, because the hardest choices were never the obvious ones, and 2 days was no time at all, and also more than enough time for everything to change. The 2 days passed without the conversation Cole had named. Not because either of them avoided it exactly, but because the ranch had its own schedule and its own demands, and a frozen water trough, and a sick mare and a section of roof over the smaller barn that had started to show daylight through it all, required attention before anything as unresolvable as the future did. Agnes understood this. She had spent enough years around working land to know that it didn't pause for human uncertainty, and she found, in the pressing of those 2 days, a kind of relief. Not in the delay itself, but in the fact that there was still work to do, and she was still the one doing it. On the morning that would have been the last of her agreed month, she got up before 4 and made breakfast and did not pack her bag. Cole came in at 5 and saw the stove lit and the coffee made and the bag not packed. And he sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around his cup and said, "I want you to stay, not as the cook, not as the housekeeper. I want to draw up a real agreement. Wages, your own room, your own schedule. Something proper." Agnes sat across from him. She had thought about what she would say when this moment came, and when it came, she found that what she'd planned to say wasn't quite right. So she said instead, "I want to stay, but I need you to understand something first." "All right," he said. "I've been managed before," she said. "After Thomas died, there were men who saw a widow with property what they thought was property, and they came in with offers and agreements and reasonable-sounding language, and by the time I understood what had happened, I had almost nothing left." She looked at him steadily. "So before I agree to anything that puts me in this house in an official capacity, I need to understand exactly what that capacity is and what it isn't. Not because I don't trust you, but because I've learned that trust and documentation are not the same thing, and one doesn't replace the other." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "That's fair," he said. "I'd like Walter to draw up something in writing," she said. "Simple language. What I do, what I'm paid, what happens if either of us decides this isn't working, and I'd like a copy of my own." "Done," Cole said, without hesitation. She nodded. "Then I'll stay." He nodded too. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, Dillard was already breaking the ice in the trough, and the sound of it, the dull, rhythmic knock of the iron bar on frozen water, was the most ordinary sound in the world, and neither of them said anything more about it, and that was enough. Walter came out 2 days later with a paper he'd drawn up himself. 3 paragraphs, clear terms, 2 lines at the bottom. Agnes read it twice, changed 2 words, and signed it. Cole signed it. Walter witnessed it and rode back to town looking pleased with himself in a way that, for once, none of the parties present held against him. November settled in over the ranch like a hand pressing down. The cold became less something that happened to you and more something you planned around, and the days shortened until there were only a few hours of real working light, and the nights were very long and very quiet. Agnes learned the particular silence of a Montana winter, different from Ohio silence, different from anything she'd known before. Bigger, less populated. She thought sometimes, lying awake in the room off the kitchen, that she could hear the distance itself. She didn't find it lonely. That surprised her. What she found instead was a strange and cautious thing that she didn't name for a long time, because naming it felt like pressing on a bruise she wasn't sure was healed yet. She found that she was glad to be here. Specifically, concretely glad. Not in the abstract way of counting her blessings, which she had always found a somewhat hollow exercise, but glad in the way of small, specific moments. The particular way the kitchen smelled in the morning when the stove had been going for an hour. The sound of the hands coming in for supper, and the way the room changed when they did. The fact that Foss had started leaving a piece of firewood at her door each morning without being asked and without saying anything about it. And Cole. The fact of Cole, which was its own specific thing she was learning the shape of slowly and without hurrying herself. He was not an easy man. She had not expected an easy man and would not have known what to do with one. He was closed in the way that people went closed after long grief, which was different from coldness. Coldness was absence, and Cole was not absent. He was present in a very precise and controlled way, the way a door can be opened just enough to let in light without letting in wind. He talked to her more now than he had at the beginning, and the things he talked about were no longer just the ranch, but the ranch was still the safest ground between them. the territory where they both moved most naturally. What she was learning, and what she thought he might also be learning, though she would not have presumed to say so, was that two people who had been alone for a long time didn't necessarily know how to be in each other's company. They had to practice it, make mistakes, back up and try again with different words. She said a thing one evening about Thomas's debts that came out harder than she'd meant, and Cole heard the hardness and didn't flinch from it, and she appreciated that more than she said. He said a thing one morning about Martha, just a sentence, just the way she'd taken her coffee, black with one piece of sugar, something so small it shouldn't have mattered, and his voice went somewhere briefly that he clearly hadn't planned for it to go. Agnes finished her own coffee and didn't look at him until he'd had a moment to come back, and he was grateful for that in the same way she had been grateful, and neither of them marked it because marking it would have made it harder. So November passed, and December came, and the ranch held together against the cold, and Agnes stayed. She was in the yard on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, carrying a basket of kitchen scraps to the compost pile near the east fence, when she heard it, the sound of a horse coming up the main road at speed, not the comfortable, unhurried pace of someone who knew where they were going, the fast kind. She set the basket down and turned toward the gate. It was Dillard, which surprised her. He'd ridden to town for supplies and hadn't been expected back until midday. He pulled up hard, and the horse was breathing fast, and Dillard's face was a particular shade of pale that she recognized as the face people made when they had information they didn't want to deliver. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Catch your breath," she said. He caught it, partially. "There's a man in town. Came in on the morning train from the east. He's been asking about you." Agnes's hands had gone still at her sides. "Did you get a name?" she said. "Holloway," Dillard said. "Vincent Holloway. He's got a lawyer with him and two other men. He went to the sheriff before he even got a room at the Decker house." The morning was very bright and very cold, and Agnes stood in the yard and looked at the gate and felt the particular sensation that came with a fear that was old enough to have its own gravity. Not the sharp fear of something new, but the heavy, settled fear of something you had been outrunning for years and had always known, somewhere in the back of everything, you had not outrun far enough. "Where's Cole?" she said. "North pasture, I think." "Get him," she said. "Please." Dillard went. Agnes stood in the yard for another moment. Then she picked up the basket and finished carrying it to the compost pile, because there was no useful purpose served by standing in the yard, and her hands needed something to do. She was back in the kitchen when Cole came in, still pulling off his gloves. Dillard half a step behind him. Cole looked at her face, and something in his own face adjusted. Not dramatically, just a slight shift, a settling into a particular kind of attention. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She kept it short and plain. Vincent Holloway, who he was, why he was here. She did not tell him everything, not yet, because everything was a longer story, and they did not have time for longer right now. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He's gone to the sheriff." "Yes." "With the lawyer." "Yes." "What's he claiming?" Agnes looked at him. She had spent the last 5 minutes deciding how much to say, and had arrived at the answer she always arrived at when she was honest with herself, which was all of it. "He's going to say I stole money from him," she said. "He's going to say I left Pittsburgh with funds that belonged to his business accounts and disappeared before I could be held responsible. He's going to have paperwork that looks very convincing." She paused. "And he's going to be lying, but the lie will be documented, and my version of the truth is currently about 1,500 miles away in the hands of a lawyer named Edmund Carr in Columbus, Ohio." Cole said, "Is the Columbus lawyer reliable?" "He was," she said. 3 years ago when I left the evidence with him, he was the most honest man I'd met in 2 years of meeting dishonest ones. Whether he still is, or whether Vincent has found a way to reach him in the time since," she stopped. "I don't know." "What kind of evidence?" "Bank records," she said. "Ledgers with entries in Vincent's own hand. 2 sworn statements from men who worked for him and saw what he did." She kept her voice steady. "After Thomas died, Vincent came to the house. He said Thomas owed him money. He said the debt was documented. He produced documents that I later learned were partially forged, the amounts altered, the dates changed. He used those documents to take almost everything we had. And when he went to do the same thing to two other families in the same situation, one of the men who worked for him had a conscience. He came to me. He told me what Vincent had done and how he'd done it, and he was willing to say so in writing. She looked at Cole. I took everything to Edmund Carr, and I left it with him. And then I left Pittsburgh, because staying in Pittsburgh meant Vincent would find a way to silence me before the evidence could be used. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Dillard, who had been standing in the doorway, had gone very still. And now he's here, Cole said. He found me, Agnes said. I don't know how. It may have been the letter, Walter's letter, in my name, going through a correspondence agency. Something traceable. Cole's jaw moved. He looked at the table. He'll get the sheriff to move fast, Agnes said. He always moves fast before anyone has time to ask questions. How fast? By tomorrow morning if he's efficient, she said. And he's always been efficient. Cole stood up. He reached for his coat. Where are you going? Agnes said. To town, he said. I want to talk to Sheriff Alderman before Vincent does. Cole? I know Alderman, he said. We've known each other 15 years. He's a fair man and he doesn't move on accusations without evidence. If I get to him first and tell him there's another side to this, he'll wait before he acts. And if you don't get to him first? Cole buttoned his coat. Then I'll still talk to him. It'll just be a different conversation. He left. Dillard looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at the door. He'll get there in time, Dillard said. Maybe, she said. She went to the stove and put more wood in because the fire was dropping and the kitchen was getting cold and she needed something to do with her hands. Cole did not get there in time. He came back in the early afternoon, and Agnes knew from the way he came through the door, not quickly, but with the particular deliberate steadiness of a man carrying something heavy, that whatever he'd hoped to prevent hadn't been prevented. Alderman was already at the Decker house when I got to town, he said. Vincent had a warrant from a justice of the peace in Billings, filed by telegraph this morning. Alderman didn't have a choice. Agnes set down the pot she was holding. He wants to bring you in, Cole said. Alderman, I mean, not Vincent's men. Alderman himself. He said he'll make it as civil as possible. He wants you to come in voluntarily rather than he wants it to be as civil as possible. When? She said. He'll come out tomorrow morning, Cole said, unless you'd rather go to him tonight. Agnes looked at the wall for a moment. What did you tell him? She said. About me. I told him you were a guest at my ranch, Cole said, that you were the most straightforward person I'd met in 10 years, and that whatever Vincent Holloway had filed in Billings, there was another account of events that deserved to be heard before anyone made any decisions. Did he listen? He listened. He always listens. Cole came to the table and sat down. He was looking at her directly, which he didn't always do. Agnes, what he said in town, Vincent. I want to hear your version from you before tomorrow. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. She folded her hands on the table, and she told him. All of it this time. Not the shortened emergency version, but the whole shape of it. Thomas's death and the creditors who appeared within weeks, and how she'd trusted the wrong people early on because she was grieving and inexperienced with the particular kind of men who circled widows. Vincent's arrival with his documents and his patient, reasonable voice. The 2 years of watching everything go. The house, the savings, the small investments Thomas had made. The man who'd worked for Vincent. His name was Gerald, and she still thought about him sometimes. Wondered if he was still alive. Who had come to her door one night and sat at her kitchen table and told her what he'd seen. The weeks of collecting documents, of copying records, of doing it all quietly enough that Vincent wouldn't notice until she was already gone. Edmund Carr in Columbus, a lawyer she'd found through a woman she trusted, a friend of Thomas's sister, who had taken the evidence and put it in his office safe and told her that when a judge was needed, he would produce it. And the money, she said, the money Vincent claims I took, it was $140. She met Cole's eyes. It was money I'd been saving in a tin in the back of a kitchen cupboard for 3 years. My own money, earned from sewing and taking in laundry after Thomas died. The account he claims I robbed. I was never on that account. I couldn't have accessed it if I'd wanted to. She paused. He knows that. He has always known that. The claim is a way to get me in front of a judge in a jurisdiction he controls, where he can make the evidence discussion happen on his terms. Cole had been listening with both hands flat on the table, very still, the way he went still when something had fully engaged him. The lawyer in Columbus, he said. Carr. Can we reach him by telegraph? Agnes looked at him. I don't know if he still has the materials. It's been 3 years. We don't know that he doesn't, Cole said. No, she said. We don't. The telegraph office is open until 8 tonight, Cole said. He stood up. Write down what you need to say to Carr, as clear and short as you can make it. I'll have Martinez ride to town and send it tonight. Agnes looked at him. Cole, whatever Carr says, even if he still has everything, a telegraph isn't going to stop tomorrow morning. No, he said. But it starts something. It tells Carr that the case he's been holding is active. It tells him where you are and who's pressing the charge, and it gives Alderman something to know about, that there's evidence in Columbus that directly contradicts whatever Vincent filed in Billings. He picked up his coat. Alderman is a fair man, I told you. He'll sit on this if he knows there's a legitimate other side coming. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and found paper. She wrote the telegraph message in 15 minutes, tight, specific, the kind of language that communicated the situation without wasting a single word. She gave it to Cole, who passed it to Martinez, who rode to town with instructions to send it and wait for any reply that came back before 8. Martinez came back at 9:30 with a reply. It was 3 lines. Agnes read it at the kitchen table with the lamp closed, and Cole standing across from her and Dillard and Foss waiting at the doorway. She looked up. He still has everything, she said. Dillard made a sound. He's going to the Columbus Federal office tomorrow morning to register the materials formally, Agnes said. He says he's been waiting for this. Something shifted in her voice briefly. He says he always thought the day would come. She set the paper down. The next morning came gray and still. Alderman arrived at 10, as he'd said, a tall, lean man in his late 50s with a decent face that carried the faint, permanent weariness of someone who had been doing a difficult job long enough to understand all its complications. He took his hat off when Agnes opened the door. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, I'm sorry about this. Don't apologize, Sheriff, she said. You're doing your job. Come in. He came in. She offered him coffee because it was cold and he'd ridden 6 miles and he was a man doing his job. And he took it, and they sat at the kitchen table with Cole at her left and Alderman across from them. And she told him what she'd told Cole and showed him the telegraph from Edmund Carr, and Alderman read it twice. Columbus Federal registration, he said. That changes the picture somewhat. It changes it considerably, Cole said. The warrant is still active, Alderman said. I can't ignore a warrant. I know, Agnes said, but I can. There's a process here. A traveling judge is due in Red Pine Crossing on the 14th. That's 11 days. He looked at the telegraph. If the Columbus materials can be formally transmitted to this jurisdiction before then, they can, Agnes said. Edmund Carr knows how to move documents through the federal system. He's been practicing law for 30 years. Alderman was quiet for a moment. He set the telegraph down. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, I'm going to need you to stay in the county. I can't have you leaving the territory while the warrant is active. You understand that? I understand, she said, and I'm going to need you to present yourself at my office by 8 in the morning each day until the judge arrives. Not in a cell. Just present yourself and sign the book and go home. He paused. Can you agree to those terms? Agnes looked at him. She thought about what Vincent Holloway would say when he heard these terms. The visible, controlled rage, the thin smile over the top of it. Yes, she said. I can agree to those terms. Alderman nodded. He picked up his hat. He looked at Cole. I'll need you to vouch for her, in writing, that she's in your care and she'll comply. Already planned to, Cole said. Alderman left. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen was quiet, and Agnes sat at the table and let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like most of the morning. Dillard, who had been hovering near the kitchen doorway again, said, "Is it going to be all right?" "I don't know," Agnes said honestly. "Better than it was yesterday," Foss said from somewhere behind Dillard. He said it like a man filing a fact. Agnes looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Better than it was yesterday." That afternoon, word came from town that Vincent Holloway was not pleased. This was delivered by the woman who ran the dry goods store, a no-nonsense widow named Clara Sutton, who had reason to visit the ranch and no reason at all to involve herself in other people's complications, except that she'd watched Vincent berate the hotel clerk for 40 minutes over a room he found insufficient, and she'd taken a dislike to him of the specific permanent variety that some women develop toward men who treated service workers like furniture. "He's a particular kind of man," Clara said to Agnes over the counter of the dry goods store where Agnes had stopped on her morning sign-in. She said it with the emphasis of a woman choosing her words carefully in a public space. "He talks about you like you're a problem he's solving." "I know how he talks about me," Agnes said. "I thought you should hear it from someone else," Clara said. "So you know you're not imagining it." She paused. "Anything you need from this store while you're here, you just ask. And I'll tell you now, I keep good records." She held Agnes's eyes. "In case it comes to being useful, I keep very good records of who buys what and when." Agnes looked at her. "Why would your records be useful?" "Because Vincent Holloway paid 2 men in cash this morning in the alley behind the hotel," Clara said. "And I happened to see it from my storeroom window, and I noted the time and what I saw." She set a wrapped parcel on the counter, the kitchen supplies Agnes had come to pick up. "I don't know what he paid them for, but in my experience, a man who pays people in cash in alleys is not paying them to do anything that needs to be done in daylight." Agnes stood at the counter and thought about this. "Mrs. Sutton," she said, "would you be willing to put what you saw in writing?" Clara Sutton already had a piece of paper out. That evening, Agnes spread on the kitchen table everything she had: the telegraph from Carr, the notes she'd made of her own account, Clara Sutton's written statement, and looked at it. Cole sat across from her, also looking. "It's not enough on its own," Agnes said. "Not yet. The Columbus materials are the foundation. Everything else is context." "Context matters in front of a judge," Cole said. "It matters if the judge sees it," she said. "A judge who is friendly to Vincent would find a way to exclude it." "Alderman said this was a traveling circuit judge," Cole said. "He doesn't owe Vincent anything. He's not from this territory." "That's something," Agnes said. "That's a lot, actually," Cole said. He looked at her. "You're used to this going badly." "I'm used to starting with something that should work and watching it get dismantled," she said. "Yes." "That's not going to happen here," Cole said. "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "I can't, but I can tell you that I'm not going to let it happen if there's anything left for me to do to prevent it." He said it plainly, without weight, the same tone he used when he said he'd see to the fence or get the supplies in by Thursday. That's not a promise about the outcome. It's just what I'm going to do. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. She had been told things like this before, by Thomas, who had meant them and not been able to deliver them, by lawyers and officials who had meant them less. She had learned to hold such statements lightly, to not put weight on them that they might not be able to bear. But Cole was not Thomas, and he was not those officials, and the thing in his face when he said it was not reassurance or performance, but just the plain, committed statement of a man who was going to do the next thing that needed doing. "All right," she said. She gathered the papers and stacked them neatly. She went to her room and got the small tin she'd been carrying in the bottom of her traveling trunk since Pittsburgh, the savings she'd protected through everything, now somewhat larger than the $140 Vincent had accused her of stealing from him, which she found both grimly funny and not funny at all. She came back and set the tin on the table. Cole looked at it. "I need to send money to Carr," she said, "for his time and whatever costs come with moving the materials. Do you know if the bank in town can wire a transfer to Columbus?" "I'll find out tomorrow," Cole said. "And Agnes, if you're short—" "I'm not short," she said firmly. "I have enough. I've been very careful for a long time." He nodded and didn't push it, which was one of the things she was learning about him, the specific and not inconsiderable grace of knowing when not to push. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge, the hard directional wind that had been coming every night now. And somewhere on the north side of the house, a loose board knocked against the frame with the patient repetition of something that would eventually need fixing. Agnes blew out the extra lamp and left the small one burning on the table. She was halfway to her room when Cole said, "She would have liked you." She stopped. "Martha," he said. He was still at the table, not looking at her. She liked people who were... She always said that the most interesting people were the ones who'd been thoroughly tested. He paused. "That's all I wanted to say." Agnes stood in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a while. Outside, the board kept knocking in the wind, and somewhere across the territory, in a hotel room in Red Pine Crossing, a man who had dismantled her life once before was lying awake planning how to do it again. And in an office in Columbus, Ohio, a lawyer named Edmund Carr was pulling a locked box from the back of his office safe and checking the contents he had kept safe for 3 years against the day someone would come asking for them. And he was writing by lamplight the cover letter that would accompany them to the territorial court in Montana. Agnes lay in the dark and breathed. She thought about the table covered in paper. She thought about Clara Sutton's careful handwriting. She thought about Cole's voice saying she would have liked you, the plainness of it, the weight it carried precisely because he hadn't tried to make it carry weight. She had spent 3 years running. She was 57 years old and tired in the way that people went tired after sustained effort, not the bone tired of a single hard day, but the accumulated weariness of years of not being able to stop. She was not running anymore. She was in a small, warm room in a house that had become, without her entirely deciding to let it, something she did not want to leave. Whatever came next, the judge, the court, Vincent's patient, lethal planning, she was going to face it from here. That was not nothing. In fact, she thought, turning onto her side in the dark, that was just about everything. The days between Agnes's agreement with Alderman and the judge's arrival were not quiet days. They had the appearance of quiet. The morning sign-ins at the sheriff's office, the ride into town and back, the regular work of the ranch continuing around and beneath the thing that was unresolved. But underneath that surface, the tension was the kind that built without showing itself until something cracked. Agnes felt it every morning when she rode into Red Pine Crossing and signed Alderman's book and rode back out, and felt the eyes on her from the people on the main street who had formed their opinions already and were not especially interested in revising them. Vincent had been busy. He was good at being busy in the particular way that men with money and patience were good at. Not visibly, not loudly, but in the way that water worked on stone. He had drinks with the right people at the Decker House bar. He had conversations at the feed store and the barber and the telegraph office. He did not say Agnes's name more than necessary. He simply described what he said had happened in the tone of a man who was tired and sorry about the whole thing, and let the description do its work. By the end of the first week, Agnes could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Not everyone. Clara Sutton was unchanged, and Alderman was unchanged. And Platt, the rancher who had spoken to her after the water rights meeting, nodded to her with the same plain respect he'd shown before. But others, the woman at the dry goods counter who had been warming to her over the previous weeks, the family from the church she'd seen at the store, pulled back. Not dramatically, just enough. Cole noticed it too. He didn't say anything about it to her directly, but she saw his jaw set on the third morning when a man she didn't know crossed the main street rather than walk past them, and she said quietly, "Don't." He looked at her. "Don't get angry on the street where he can see it," she said. "That's what he wants. He wants you frustrated and reactive, because frustrated and reactive men make statements that can be used against them." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know that's what he wants?" "Because it's what he always wanted," she said. "Every time someone pushed back against him too hard and too publicly, he used it. Turned the anger into the story." She kept her voice low, her face forward. "The story he wants people to see is, a dishonest woman showed up in a quiet town and caused trouble, and now a reasonable man has come to deal with it. The moment you lose your temper in public, you become the trouble." Cole looked straight ahead. They kept walking. Then what do? He said. We wait for Edmund Carr, she said, and we let the documents speak instead of us. The telegraph from Carr came on the 8th day. Agnes was at the ranch when Martinez brought it in from town, and she read it standing in the kitchen doorway with the cold at her back and Cole beside her. Carr had filed the materials with the Federal Territorial Office in Helena. They had been logged, assigned a case reference number, and a formal notice had been transmitted to the Red Pine Crossing Circuit Court ahead of the judge's arrival. The materials included the original ledger pages, the 2 signed statements, and a third document Agnes hadn't known Carr had, a letter from the bank in Pittsburgh dated 18 months after she'd left, stating that an internal audit had flagged irregularities in 3 accounts associated with Vincent Holloway's business, one of which matched the account he claimed Agnes had robbed. Agnes read that last part twice. He had a bank audit against him, Cole said, reading over her shoulder. I didn't know about that, Agnes said. I left before it happened. She looked at the paper. Carr must have gathered it afterward. He kept building the case even after I was gone. The man's thorough, Cole said. He's a good lawyer, Agnes said, and her voice went somewhere brief and real. He didn't have to keep working on it. I wasn't paying him. I couldn't pay him. She stopped. He just kept working on it. Cole looked at her profile for a moment. Some people do that, he said. I know, she said. I'm just not used to being on the receiving end of it. She put the telegraph in the tin with the other documents and went back to the stove, because supper needed starting and the day wasn't over, and she had learned a long time ago that gratitude was most honestly expressed by continuing to function rather than by sitting down in it. That night, Cole rode to Alderman's house, not the office, the house, and told him about the Carr telegraph and the Helena filing and the bank audit letter. Alderman listened, asked 3 questions, and said he would contact the circuit court first thing in the morning to ensure the materials were flagged for the judge before the hearing began. He also said, and he said it carefully, that Vincent's lawyer had filed a motion to have the hearing expedited, moved to the 12th instead of the 14th. Can he do that? Cole said. He filed the motion, Alderman said. Whether the judge grants it depends on the judge, but the filing tells me something. That they want to move before the Columbus materials are formally entered, Cole said. That's what it tells me too, Alderman said. He looked at Cole steadily. I'm going to oppose the motion, in writing tomorrow morning. But Cole, you need to understand that I can only do what the law allows me to do. If the judge grants the motion, he won't, Cole said. You don't know that. I know that a judge who looks at a motion to expedite filed 2 days after a federal evidence package is logged in, Helena is going to ask himself why someone wants to move fast, Cole said. And the answer to that question is not going to reflect well on Vincent Holloway. Alderman looked at him for a moment. You've been spending time with a woman who thinks like a lawyer. She doesn't think like a lawyer, Cole said. She thinks like someone who has been on the wrong side of lawyers for a long time. It's different. Alderman almost smiled. Go home, Cole. Cole went home. He told Agnes about the motion in the morning, over coffee, in the same plain tone he used for everything, and she sat with it for a moment and then said, He's scared. Vincent? The motion means he's scared, she said. He filed fast because the Helena package surprised him. He didn't know about Carr, or he thought Carr had given up. Now he knows the documents exist and are in the system, and he can't make them disappear. She set her cup down. Scared men move fast and make mistakes. That's the first genuinely good news we've had. The motion was denied on the 10th day. The judge, a circuit man named Hargrove, who had been riding the Montana Territory for 9 years and had the look of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and was not especially impressed by any of them, reviewed the opposition filing, noted the federal evidence package, and kept the hearing on the 14th. Vincent's lawyer came to Alderman's office that afternoon and made statements that Alderman later described to Cole as vigorous. Alderman described his own response as brief. On the 11th day, everything changed. Agnes was signing the morning book at Alderman's office when one of the deputies came in from the alley door with a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be alarmed. He went to Alderman and said something low that Agnes couldn't hear, and Alderman looked up at her and said, "Excuse me a moment," in a tone that was too careful. He was gone 4 minutes. When he came back, he told her. Gerald Marsh, the man who had worked for Vincent, the man who had given Agnes the evidence 3 years ago, the man whose signed statement was in Edmund Carr's package, had arrived in Red Pine Crossing on the morning train. He had come to testify. Agnes stood very still. He came on his own, she said. Apparently Carr contacted him when the case was reactivated, Alderman said. He agreed to come. He's at the Decker house now, and I need you to understand. He paused. His being here changes this considerably. A signed statement is one thing. A living witness is another. I know, Agnes said. It also makes him a target, Alderman said. He held her eyes. Vincent Holloway is not going to be pleased. Agnes looked at the door. Does Vincent know he's here? I don't know, Alderman said, but in a town this size, he'll know before nightfall. She rode back to the ranch fast. She told Cole at the barn door before she'd even properly dismounted, and he listened, and his face went through something that was not quite alarm, but was the cousin of it. We need to move the hearing, he said. We can't move the hearing, she said. Hargrove just held the date. Not move it. Move Marsh. He can't stay at the Decker house. Vincent's men are 3 doors down. Cole was already thinking practically, the way he always was, already past the problem and into the solution. He needs to be somewhere Vincent can't get to him easily. He's a grown man, Cole. I can't ask him to... I'll ask him, Cole said. He doesn't know me. He might say no. But I'd rather ask and be told no than not ask and have something happen to him the night before the hearing. He was pulling the saddle off her horse now, doing it quickly. Go inside. I'll ride to town. Cole... Agnes. He stopped and looked at her over the horse's back. Let me do something. I've been watching you carry this for 11 days. Let me do something. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside. Gerald Marsh was a slight man in his late 40s with a careful way of holding himself that spoke to years of being in rooms where he didn't entirely belong. He had worked as a bookkeeper for Vincent's business for 6 years and had watched the irregularities accumulate for 4 of those 6 years before his conscience had finally made itself impossible to ignore. He did not look like a heroic man. He looked like a man who had made one decision to do the right thing and was still paying for it. Cole found him at the Decker house and introduced himself and stated his business directly because he'd learned that direct was the only approach worth using when time was short, and Marsh had listened and said, after a moment, He's here, isn't he? Holloway. I saw a man in the lobby who... He's here, Cole said. You don't have to come to my ranch. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you'd like somewhere safer to be between now and Thursday morning. Marsh was quiet. Agnes Whitlock, he said. Is she all right? She's better than all right, Cole said. She's been managing this entire situation with more composure than most men I know could manage. Marsh looked at the table. I should have come sooner, he said. When she first disappeared, when I heard she'd run, I thought about coming forward then, making a statement publicly, but I had a wife and 2 children, and I told myself it wasn't my fight. He stopped. It was my fight. I was just afraid. You're here now, Cole said. I'm here now, Marsh said, for what it's worth. It's worth a great deal, Cole said. More than you probably know. Will you come? Marsh came. He arrived at the ranch that evening with a single bag and the quiet, careful manner of a man who was trying to take up as little space as possible. And Agnes met him at the door, and they looked at each other for a moment. 2 people who had been connected by a terrible circumstance 3 years ago and had not seen each other since. Gerald, she said. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. I'm sorry it took me this long. You're here, she said in the same tone Cole had used, and she meant it the same way. Come inside. Have you eaten? He had not eaten. She fed him. The hands gave him the spare bunk in the smaller room off the bunkhouse and treated him with the same uncomplicated acceptance they'd extended to Agnes. Not because they knew his story in detail, but because Cole had brought him here and Cole's judgment had proven reliable. The 12th day was uneventful. The 13th was not. Martinez came in from the evening fence check at 9 o'clock, which was late for him, and his face had a look to it that made Cole set down his coffee. North perimeter, Martinez said. Tracks. 3 horses coming from the Red Pine Road. They stopped at the fence line and turned back. He paused. Recent. Maybe 2 hours ago. Cole looked at him. You're sure they turned back? I followed them 3/4 of a mile, Martinez said. They went back toward the main road. He paused again. One of them had a particular shoe on the left rear, notched on the outside edge. I saw that shoe in the Decker House stable yard this morning when I was in town for the wire. The kitchen was very quiet. They were scouting, Cole said. That's what it looked like, Martinez said. Cole looked at Agnes, who was at the table with Marsh. Marsh had gone pale. Agnes had gone the other thing, that stillness that he'd first seen on the bench at the station, except that now he knew it was not passivity. It was the stillness of someone who was thinking very fast and very clearly. He's not going to wait for the hearing, she said. No, Cole said. He's going to try to make sure Gerald doesn't testify, she said, or the documents don't arrive, or both. The documents are already logged in Helena, Cole said. He can't touch those. He can try to discredit Gerald, she said, or prevent him from appearing. She looked at Marsh. Is there anything in your past that Vincent could use against you? Anything that would make your testimony look unreliable? Marsh thought about it with the honesty of a man who understood what was at stake. I was let go from a bookkeeping position in '82 for a calculation error, he said. It was a genuine error, not fraud, but he could frame it as incompetence or dishonesty. He'll try, Agnes said. That's the lever he'll use if he can't stop you physically. She looked at Cole. We need Marsh's character documented before Thursday. Someone in this town who can speak to who he is. He just arrived, Cole said. Alderman, she said. If Marsh goes to Alderman tonight and gives a voluntary statement, his account, his background, his reason for coming, then any attempt Vincent makes to discredit him on Thursday will look like exactly what it is, a defense tactic. Cole was already standing. I'll ride to Alderman. Take Martinez, Agnes said. Agnes, take Martinez, she said again. I'm serious, Cole. Don't ride alone tonight. He took Martinez. They rode to Alderman's house and were there for 90 minutes. And when they came back, Marsh had a signed and witnessed statement of voluntary testimony filed with the sheriff's office, and Alderman had quietly arranged for his deputy to make a visible pass by the ranch on the hour between midnight and 4. That should have been enough for the night. It was not enough for the night. Agnes woke at 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. It was not the wood smoke of the stove. It had a different quality, acrid and chemical, with something underneath it that her sleeping mind recognized as wrong before her waking mind caught up. She sat up. She got to the window. The freight warehouse at the edge of the station property, a large outbuilding that the ranch used to store equipment and supplies between deliveries, adjacent to the station's own storage, was burning. She was out of her room before she finished the thought. The kitchen was already filling with a thin haze, and she could hear shouting from the yard. And when she got to the back door, Cole was already out there, his coat half on, shouting at Dillard to get the buckets and at Foss to ride for town. Gerald, she said. Cole turned. Bunkhouse is clear. Martinez has him. It's the warehouse, she said. I know. His voice was controlled, but barely. The equipment for the spring planting, the stored feed for the winter cattle, it's all in there. How did it start? I don't know yet. Cole? She grabbed his arm. This is Vincent. I know it's Vincent, he said. He's not trying to burn the building, she said. He's trying to cost you. If the feed is gone and the equipment is gone and you're spending the next 3 days dealing with the loss, I know what he's trying to do, Cole said. And there was an edge in his voice now, not anger at her, but the controlled, directed anger of a man who had been patient for 11 days and was reaching the outer boundary of patience. I also need to put this fire out before it gets to the barn. He went. The next hour was one of the ugliest Agnes had experienced in a long time, and she had a substantial field of comparison. The fire had gotten into the east wall of the warehouse before anyone reached it with water, and fighting it in the dark was a matter of throwing water at something that wasn't entirely visible, and hoping the parts you couldn't see weren't the parts where the fire was strongest. The Decker House deputy, making his hourly pass, Exactly as Alderman had arranged, arrived 20 minutes in and was immediately useful. Dillard burned his forearm on a falling timber and said words that Agnes pretended not to hear. Marsh appeared from the bunkhouse at some point and simply started working, filling buckets and passing them down the line without being told. Cole went inside the warehouse. Agnes saw him go in and her stomach dropped. He came out 3 minutes later dragging 2 of the large seed sacks, 100 pounds each from the look of them. And his coat was smoking at the shoulder and his face was black with soot and he was coughing, but he was upright and moving, and she crossed the yard in about 5 seconds. "Stop," she said. "There are 4 more bags." "Stop," she said again, and put herself between him and the door, which was something she had not planned to do and which she suspected would require some internal accounting later. "There are 4 bags of seed. There is one of you. Do not go back in there." He looked at her. He was breathing hard and his eyes were streaming from the smoke, and for a moment she thought he was going to push past her anyway. "Cole," she said. He stopped. "The fire is going to take the rest of it," she said. "And that is a terrible loss, and I am sorry for it, but the hearing is in," she calculated, 11 hours, and I need you to still be standing when it happens." He stood in front of her, breathing, for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. The fire took another 40 minutes to control and another hour to fully put out, and what was left of the east half of the warehouse was a blackened frame with a collapsed roof section and the smell of wet char that Agnes knew from experience would be in everything for days. They saved approximately half the winter feed, 2 of the 6 planting equipment pieces, and the 2 seed bags Cole had dragged out. The rest was gone. Dillard's arm was wrapped. Cole had a burn across the back of his left hand that he declined to comment on and that Agnes cleaned and bandaged at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, while he sat with the stunned flatness of someone who had been running on emergency for 3 hours and had just run out. "How bad is the feed loss?" she said, wrapping his hand. "We'll need to buy in," he said, "before the first hard cold, which means a trip to Billings and cost I hadn't planned. Can the ranch carry it?" "This year? Yes." He looked at his hand. "Ask me in spring." She tied off the bandage. She did not let go of his hand right away. She was not entirely sure why she didn't let go, and she did not think about it carefully enough to answer the question before he looked up and found her looking at him. "He did this to stop the hearing," Cole said. "He did it to make everything harder," Agnes said. "He knew it wouldn't stop the hearing. He's too smart to think one fire stops a federal filing. He did it because if I see what he's capable of doing to the people around me, I might decide to withdraw." "Will you?" Cole said. She let go of his hand. She sat back. "No," she said. "I've been through worse than a fire, and I've been running away from him for 3 years, and I am finished running." He looked at her for a long moment in the low lamplight. The 2 of them at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning with soot on both their faces and the smell of char still in the air, and he said quietly, "All right." "All right," she said. Alderman arrived at 6:30. He had already been at the station. Someone in town had seen the smoke and sent for him. And he came to the ranch with a face that was not the fair and patient face of an ordinary morning. "The notched shoe," he said to Cole. "Martinez can describe it," Cole said. And the deputy who was making the pass, he saw a horse tied at the far end of the station road when he came by at one. He didn't think anything of it at the time. Alderman took notes. He looked at the burned warehouse. He looked at Cole's bandaged hand and at Agnes's face and at Gerald Marsh, who was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had made peace with the fact that the world was going to be dangerous today. "I'm going to make an arrest this morning," Alderman said. "Not Vincent. Not yet. One of the men he paid, the one with the notched shoe, if I can match the horse." He paused. "Depending on what that man says under pressure, it leads to Vincent," Cole said. "It may," Alderman said. "These men usually talk when they understand that talking is better than not talking." He left at 7. At 7:45 he sent a message, a boy from town with a folded note, that said he had one of the men in custody. The note contained 2 words beneath that. He talked. Agnes read the note at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her and the morning light coming flat and gray through the kitchen window, and she sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up and said, "We need to be at the courthouse by 9. The courthouse in Red Pine Crossing was not a grand building. It was a repurposed meeting hall with better chairs than usual and a raised platform at the front where a desk had been placed for Judge Hargrove. It filled up faster than Agnes expected. Not just ranchers and town people, but faces she recognized from the main street, people who had been watching this story develop and had come to see how it ended. Vincent was there. He sat at a table to the left with his lawyer, a thin man in a good suit who had the careful expression of someone reassessing a situation he'd thought he had controlled. Vincent himself looked, when Agnes entered with Cole at her side and Marsh behind them, like a man watching something approach that he'd been told would not approach. He looked at her. She looked back. She had spent a great deal of her life being afraid of that look. This morning, she was not afraid of it. She was not certain why, except that she had spent the last night in a burning yard and the last 3 years outrunning this man, and she had simply, at some point in the last 11 days, run out of fear the way you ran out of a particular fuel. Not gone exactly, but burned through. Judge Hargrove was compact and gray-bearded and entirely unimpressed by the full room, which Agnes found genuinely reassuring. He called the proceedings to order, reviewed the filed materials with the brisk competence of a man who had read everything and did not need to perform the reading for an audience, and began. Vincent's lawyer made his case first. It was smooth. It referenced the original warrant, the documented debt, Agnes's departure from Pittsburgh, the money he claimed she had taken. He had a bank statement, not from Pittsburgh, from a smaller bank in western Pennsylvania, that showed a withdrawal that he claimed matched the amount. He did not mention the Pittsburgh bank audit. He did not mention Edmund Carr. Judge Hargrove asked 3 questions. The third one was about the withdrawal date on the Pennsylvania bank statement and whether it preceded or followed Agnes's departure. The lawyer's pause before answering was half a second too long. Hargrove made a note and moved on. Edmund Carr's materials were entered formally. The ledger pages, the signed statements, the Pittsburgh bank audit letter. Hargrove reviewed them at the bench with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the time he spent now was the time the law needed to be worth anything. Gerald Marsh testified. He was not a polished witness. He spoke too quietly at first, and Hargrove had to ask him to speak up, and he gripped the edge of the chair with both hands, and his voice went unsteady twice. But what he said was specific, dated, and corroborated by the ledger pages Carr had provided. And when Vincent's lawyer cross-examined him and raised the 1882 dismissal, Marsh looked at the lawyer with the calm of a man who had been afraid of this moment for a long time and had arrived to find it smaller than the fear. "I made an arithmetic error," he said. "I've made others since. Everyone who has worked alongside me for the last 15 years would tell you my character. I'm sure you can ask them." He paused. "The question isn't whether I've made mistakes. The question is whether what I saw in Vincent Holloway's ledger was what I said it was. And it was." Hargrove sustained an objection from Vincent's lawyer about the last sentence. Then he looked at Marsh and said, "The record will reflect the witness's statement," and made another note. Alderman testified briefly about the warrant for the arrested man, and the man's statement implicating Vincent in directing the fire, and the physical evidence of the notched shoe matching a horse in the Decker House stable. Vincent's lawyer objected to the introduction of the arson evidence as prejudicial to the financial case. Hargrove looked at him. "Counselor, the arson evidence speaks directly to your client's willingness to obstruct proceedings and intimidate witnesses. I'll decide what's prejudicial." He set his pen down. "Is there anything further from the defense?" There was not anything further from the defense. Hargrove took 40 minutes. He came back and he read his findings in the flat, precise language of a man who found legal language to be an accurate tool rather than an obstacle. And what he found was, the warrant against Agnes Whitlock was dismissed. The evidence presented by Edmund Carr's package, corroborated by Gerald Marsh's testimony and the Pittsburgh bank audit, established a pattern of fraud originating with Vincent Holloway's business practices. The arson and witness intimidation charges arising from the warehouse fire would be tried separately and carried a federal component given the attempted obstruction of a territorial court proceeding. Vincent Holloway was taken into custody in the courtroom. He did not go quietly. He said things as Alderman put the handcuffs on that Agnes did not look at him for. She was looking at the window. Outside, the December sky had cleared overnight, and the light coming through the courthouse glass was the thin, specific light of a cold, bright morning, and it fell across the floorboards in a long rectangle that reached almost to where she was sitting. Cole's hand, the bandaged one, covered hers on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held on. The room around them was loud with the kind of noise that follows a resolution, voices and movement, and the particular release of people who had been holding a collective breath. And Agnes sat in the middle of it and held Cole's hand and breathed. Gerald Marsh found her outside on the courthouse steps afterward. He had his hat in his hands again. "It's over," he said. "The financial case," she said. "The rest will take longer." "But you're free," he said. She looked out at the main street of Red Pine Crossing, the same street she had been riding into every morning for 11 days to sign a book and be watched and be measured by people making up their minds about her. It looked different today. Not entirely different, but the difference was real. "Yes," she said. "I am." Marsh left on the afternoon train. He shook Cole's hand and nodded at Agnes and said he hoped things went well for her, and she thanked him for coming, and she meant it in a way that she didn't have words for that were proportionate to what it had cost him. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that came after noise, the specific, settled quiet of something that had been held taut finally releasing. Cole drove and Agnes sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and neither of them needed to. The sun was going west behind the ridgeline by the time they pulled into the ranch yard. Dillard came out of the barn and saw their faces and said, "Well?" "Well," Cole said, climbing down. Dillard looked at Agnes. She nodded once. He went back into the barn, and a moment later she heard him say something to Foss. And whatever he said, Foss's response was the single syllable she'd come to recognize as his version of genuine satisfaction. Agnes stood in the yard in the cold, clear afternoon and looked at the house, and then at the burned-out warehouse frame beyond the fence line, and then at the ridge beyond that, going dark and blue in the falling light. There was a great deal of work to do. The warehouse needed clearing, the feed situation needed addressing, the spring planting would require rethinking. These were real problems with real solutions, and they would take time and effort and planning, and she knew exactly how to begin on all of them. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she thought, following Cole up the porch steps into the warm and lamp-lit house that smelled like wood smoke and the remnants of the morning's coffee. Tonight was for sitting at the kitchen table and not being in danger, which was a thing she had not been able to do in longer than she wanted to count, and she was going to do it without looking over her shoulder. For the first time in 3 years, she was going to simply sit, and it was going to be enough. The morning after the hearing, Agnes woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay in the dark for a moment longer than usual. It was a small thing. An extra minute, maybe 2, of simply being horizontal in a warm room without the weight of what was coming pressing down on the day before it started. She had not realized until it lifted how much she had been carrying the awareness of Vincent Holloway as a constant pressure. Not always in the front of her mind, but always there, the way a bad tooth made itself known, even when you weren't touching it. Present, unavoidable, shaping everything around it. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. The stove had been running all night, and the kitchen was warm on the other side of the wall. Somewhere outside, an owl was finishing its night. The wind had died down, and the silence was the full, specific silence of a winter morning before anyone was moving. And Agnes listened to it and thought, this is what it sounds like when nothing is wrong. She got up, she made coffee, she started breakfast. Cole came in at 5:15 and stopped in the kitchen doorway in the way he sometimes did. Not dramatically, just a pause, taking the room in. And she handed him a cup without turning around, and he said, "You slept." "I did," she said. "First time in a while, I'd guess." "First time in longer than a while," she said. She turned from the stove. "How's the hand?" He held it up. The bandage was still clean. "Stiff, it's fine." "Let me look at it after breakfast." He sat down. She set a plate in front of him, eggs, salt pork, the last of the biscuits from yesterday that she'd wrapped in cloth to keep, and sat across from him with her own plate. They ate in the comfortable quiet that had become, over the past 2 months, one of the things she valued most about mornings here. It wasn't the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had said enough that the quiet between words carried its own meaning. "What happens now?" he said, after a while. With Vincent. Legally. The federal arson charge will take months, she said. Edmund Carr thinks the fraud case will be picked up by the territorial prosecutor. There are 2 other families in Pittsburgh who lost money the same way Thomas and I did. Carr has been in contact with them. She set down her fork. It won't be fast. These things are never fast, but it's in motion now and it's out of my hands, and those are 2 things I haven't been able to say in 3 years. Cole nodded. He looked at his coffee. And Marsh, he said. He telegraphed from Billings last night. He made his connection for the eastbound. She paused. He said to thank you for the bunk and the supper and not asking him more questions than he could answer. Cole looked up at that. I didn't do anything particular. You gave him somewhere safe to be, Agnes said. That was particular. He knew what it cost. Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, Dillard's boots on the frozen ground announced the start of the working day, and the ranch began assembling itself around them the way it did every morning. The sounds of the barn and the trough and the particular creak of the bunkhouse door that needed its hinge oiled and probably always would. I need to get to Billings before the end of the week, Cole said, for the feed, before the next cold front comes down. I know, she said. I've been calculating the gap. We're short approximately 40% of what we'd planned for the winter cattle. You can make it up if you move fast. He looked at her. You've been calculating the gap. I had time yesterday evening, she said. The numbers are on the table. He looked at the table. A folded piece of paper was sitting near the edge. Her handwriting, neat columns. He picked it up. He read it. He set it down. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. I was going to go crazy sitting still. Something moved through his expression. She had gotten better at reading him over these weeks. Not fluent exactly, but better. What moved through him now was something complicated and quiet, the way certain emotions were when they'd been waiting long enough that they'd learned to keep themselves contained. Agnes, he said. Cole, let me say it first this time, he said. She stopped. She waited. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her, and he was not a man who gave speeches, and he knew it, so what he said was plain. I'm going to need someone to manage the Billings negotiation, he said, because I know cattle and I know land, but you know what I paid last year and what I should have paid, and the difference between those 2 numbers is not small. He paused. And I'm going to need someone to write to the county land office about the warehouse damage claim, because there's a form to fill and a procedure, and you'll do it faster and better than I will. He paused again. And I'm going to need someone at that table every morning and most evenings, and I know that's a different kind of asking than the Billings negotiation or the land office form, and I know I'm not... He stopped. He started again. I'm not a simple man to live alongside. I know that. Agnes looked at him. I'm not a simple woman, she said. No, he said. You're really not. And the way he said it was not a complaint. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the bench at Red Pine Crossing Station 4 months ago, the empty platform, the cold, the singular certainty that she had run out of options, and was now simply waiting to find out what running out of options looked like in practice. She thought about Thomas and the 22 years that had been real and good, even when they were also insufficient. She thought about what she had learned in the long, hard education of the years since Thomas, about what she actually needed versus what she had once thought she needed. What she needed, she had come to understand, was not rescue. She had never needed rescue. What she had needed, what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking, was ground. Solid ground under her feet, real and specific and hers. She looked around the kitchen, at the shelves she had reorganized, at the stove she had learned the particular temperament of, at the window she stood at every morning watching the yard wake up, and the yard that had become as familiar to her as any yard she had known. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Cole looked at her. Not as the cook, she said, not as the housekeeper, not on a 1-month agreement or a written contract or any other arrangement that has a built-in exit. She held his eyes. I'm staying because this is where I want to be, and I want you to know that's the reason. Not obligation, not necessity, want. Cole was very still. All right, he said. All right, she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. the bandaged one, which she suspected was not the hand he'd intended, but which was what he had. And it wasn't a gesture from a novel. It was a little awkward. His hand was too warm from the bandage, and hers was cold from the morning, and they sat like that for a moment at a kitchen table that needed a new coat of finish on the surface, and it was entirely imperfect and entirely real. Dillard appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later to ask about the feed schedule, and took in the situation with the quick, genuine delight of someone too young to pretend they hadn't noticed things. "Morning," he said, with extreme neutrality. "Good morning," Agnes said. He got his coffee and left with the specific efficiency of a man performing an exit. They heard him outside say something to Foss, and they could not hear what Foss said back. But whatever it was made Dillard laugh, and the sound of it came through the kitchen wall, uncomplicated and warm. And Agnes thought, this specific ordinary morning, this is what it was all for. The week that followed was the working kind. Cole rode to Billings on the Thursday, and Agnes did not go with him this time. There was too much at the ranch that needed managing. But she wrote him a set of notes on the feed purchase, what to ask for, what to refuse, what the ceiling price should be before he walked away. He took the notes. He came back on Saturday with the feed secured at $2 under her ceiling and a look on his face that she recognized as the particular satisfaction of a man who had done something well and knew why. The man wanted to start at the higher number, Cole said, unsaddling in the barn. I asked him the questions you wrote down. He adjusted. They always adjust when you ask the right questions, she said. It tells them you know what you're looking at. You could have gotten it another $1 cheaper, he said. Probably, she said. But $1 cheaper and him feeling like he lost makes future dealings harder. $2 cheaper and him feeling like it was fair means he'll deal with you again next year. Cole looked at her over the horse's back. You think about the next year. I always think about the next year, she said. It's how you plan. He was quiet for a moment. Martha thought about the next year, he said. It was not a comparison, or not only a comparison. It was the kind of thing he said now occasionally when something reminded him and he let himself say it instead of carrying it quietly. She had noticed this and was glad of it. She sounds like she was practical, Agnes said. She was, he said. Practical and warm, which is harder to manage together than people think. It is, Agnes said. Thomas was warm but not practical, and I spent 22 years filling in the practical part. It had its own satisfactions. She handed him the curry comb. But a person who is both, that's fortunate. Cole curried the horse and Agnes waited, and after a moment he said, without looking at her, You're both. She didn't answer right away. She thought about the version of herself who had sat on that station bench 4 months ago, worn down to something she'd barely recognized as herself, with a forged letter and a tin of savings and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of years of surviving on what she could manage. She thought about whether that woman would recognize who she was now, in this barn, in this conversation. She thought that woman would. She thought that woman had always known this version was in there, waiting for something solid enough to stand on. I'm working on it, she said finally. That was truer than a simple yes. Cole almost smiled. Good enough, he said. In town, things had shifted. Not entirely. Towns didn't shift entirely, and Agnes had lived long enough not to expect them to. There were still people who had made up their minds during Vincent's 2 weeks in Red Pine Crossing and would need time, or new information, or simply the long, slow erosion of a persistent alternative narrative before they revised their opinions. Agnes was not bothered by this. She had learned that the most reliable way to answer a question about your character was to keep demonstrating it until people got bored of asking. But there were also things that were different. Clara Sutton had put a hand-lettered card in the window of the dry goods store that said simply, Whitlock account welcome here, which was her version of a declaration, and Agnes accepted it as such. Platt, the rancher, had stopped her on the main street to say that he'd spoken to 2 of the other ranchers about the water rights follow-up with the county assessor, and they wanted to know if she'd be willing to review the documentation before they submitted it. She said she would. Alderman, who was not a man who wasted words on social warmth, told her one morning when she came in to officially close out her sign-in requirement that Red Pine Crossing had needed someone who could read a land contract since the previous postmaster left 4 years ago, and he said it in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a suggestion. But the observation was clear. What she was becoming, slowly and without having planned it, was part of something, not absorbed into it. She was too particular a person and had been too long alone in herself to dissolve into any community, but connected to it. The specific lateral connections of a person who had skills and used them and was present enough that people began to factor her into their thinking. This was not a small thing. She had not expected it. It turned out to be one of the larger things. Walter Briggs found her one afternoon in the third week of December, on the platform at Red Pine Crossing Station. She was there to pick up a package that had come from Columbus, Edmund Carr, sending a formal copy of the filed materials for her own records. And Walter was at his window closing out the afternoon ledger, and they had not spoken properly since the morning in Cole's kitchen when he'd told her the truth and she'd accepted his apology. He saw her and came to the window, and there was a moment of the specific awkwardness of two people who had unfinished emotional business, and neither of them was entirely sure how finished it was. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Walter," she said. She had decided weeks ago to use his first name. He had made a bad decision that had upended her life, and he had done it because he'd looked at two lonely people and felt something, and she had decided that the name was the appropriate temperature for all of that. "I heard about the hearing," he said. "I was going to come out to the ranch. I didn't know if I'd be—" "You'd have been welcome," she said. "Come out for supper sometime. Cole would like that." Walter looked at her. His round face did something sincere and slightly undone. Are you all right?" "Truly." Agnes thought about the question. She always thought about questions before she answered them, which was a habit some people found frustrating, and she had no intention of changing. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I'm situated." "Situated?" he repeated. "It's the right word," she said. "I have ground under my feet. I know where I am and what I'm doing and who I'm doing it with." She picked up the package from the counter. "That's not a small thing, Walter. Most people spend their whole lives trying to get to situated and never quite make it." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad," he said. "I know it didn't come about the right way." "No," she said. "It didn't, but it came." She held his eyes. "You can be sorry about the method and still acknowledge the destination, I think. Both things can be true." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Martha would have said something like that," he said, "if she'd been here." Agnes looked at him. He had known her, she realized, had known Cole's wife, had watched the years accumulate between the loss and now. There were people in this town who held the history she didn't have, and she was not going to pretend that wasn't a real thing. "Tell me about her sometime," Agnes said. "I'd like to know." Walter looked surprised. Then he nodded. "I'd like that too," he said. She walked back to where Cole was waiting with the wagon, and he saw the package under her arm and the expression on her face and said, "Walter?" "We're going to have him for supper sometime," she said, climbing up. Cole looked at the station window where Walter was watching them from behind the glass. He raised a hand. Walter raised one back. "All right," Cole said, and released the brake. Christmas came to the ranch with the particular low-key character of a place where people celebrated practically rather than elaborately. Dillard had put a length of pine bough over the bunkhouse door, which Foss had looked at with an expression that suggested he considered it unnecessary, but was not going to say so. Martinez had produced a bottle of something from his personal stores that he shared out on Christmas Eve without comment, and which none of the others asked questions about. Agnes made a proper dinner. Not extravagant, the supplies didn't warrant extravagant, but genuine and complete, the kind of meal that required planning and timing and the particular attention to several things at once that she had always found satisfying in the way that difficult things done well were satisfying. Roast beef, which Cole had quietly procured from Platt's ranch in a trade for some fence repair work that had nothing to do with Christmas, but conveniently produced the beef in time for it. Potatoes, carrots, a gravy that she built from the drippings the way her mother had taught her, with patience and constant attention. They ate at the long kitchen table. All of them, Cole at one end, Agnes at the other, the hands in between with the comfortable familiarity of people who had been eating together long enough to have stopped being formal about it. Dillard talked more than anyone. Foss ate more than anyone. Martinez refilled cups without being asked, which was his version of festivity. At some point near the end, Dillard said, "This time last year I was eating salted jerky out of a bag in a boarding house in Fort Collins." And the way he said it made it clear he wasn't complaining about Fort Collins so much as noting the difference. "And this time last year," Foss said, which surprised everyone because Foss rarely began sentences unprompted, "I ate alone." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. He looked at Agnes. "Better now." Agnes looked at him. "Yes," she said, "better now." The new year came in cold and clear, and the ranch went into the deep of winter with its supplies secured and its accounts in better order than they had been in the fall, and the burned warehouse frame cleared and the salvageable materials stacked for reuse in the spring rebuild. Agnes had written to the county insurance office with a damage claim that was accurate, specific, and documented with the particular care that made adjusters take claims seriously, rather than looking for reasons to reduce them. The reply came back in mid-January, and the settlement was within 5% of what she had estimated, which she considered a reasonable outcome and Cole considered slightly miraculous. "It's not miraculous," she told him, the same thing she'd told Dillard about the biscuits 3 months ago. "It's just knowing what language to use." "Where did you learn the language?" "The same place I learned everything else," she said, "by having no one to do it for me and needing it done." He looked at her in the way she had come to recognize as the way he looked at her when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. She waited. "I spent 19 years deciding that the answer to loss was to need less," he said. "Less company, less expectation, less everything. I got very good at it." He paused. "I was wrong." "You weren't wrong exactly," she said. "You were doing the best you could with a wound that hadn't healed. People do that. The mistake is thinking the reduction is permanent, thinking that because you needed less for a while, you'll need less forever." "Is that what you thought, after Thomas?" She considered it honestly. "I thought the practical version of that," she said. "I told myself I didn't need security. I could build it. I didn't need companionship. I had work. I didn't need to trust anyone. I could manage alone." She looked at her hands. "I was wrong in the same direction. I got efficient, and I got capable, and I got very lonely, and I called it independence." "It was independence," he said. "It was also lonely," she said. Both things were true. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm glad Walter Briggs is a meddlesome old fool." Something in her chest moved, brief and warm. "So am I," she said. "Don't tell him that." "He already knows," Cole said. Spring came the way it always came to the high country. Not gently, not as a relief, but as a contest that winter eventually lost. March was still brutal in the mornings, and the mud season in April was the particular, exhausting mud of a landscape releasing everything it had been holding frozen for months. The East Pasture fence required 3 days of work that left Martinez and Dillard comprehensively filthy, and Cole's repaired hand aching in the cold, in a way he mentioned once and then didn't mention again. The warehouse rebuild began in May. It was not a fast project. They did it themselves, Cole in the hands and 2 men from town who came out on the weekends in exchange for arrangements that involved Agnes's cooking and which she had negotiated personally. It took 6 weeks, and the result was solid and square and a marked improvement on the original, which had been built 40 years ago by someone with more optimism than construction experience. The day they finished the roof, Agnes brought lunch out to the yard, and they ate sitting on the lumber pile, and the sun was warm for the first time in months. And Dillard said, looking at the new building, "You know what it needs?" "Don't say a sign," Foss said. "A sign," Dillard said. "No," Foss said. "Something simple. Just no," Foss said. Agnes looked at Cole. Cole was looking at the warehouse with the expression of a man who had spent 6 weeks building something and was permitting himself one unguarded moment of satisfaction about it. She thought about what Walter had said, that morning on the platform. Situated. She thought about what it had cost to get here. The years of managing alone, the flight from Pittsburgh, the bench in the cold, the fire, the courtroom, the slow, patient work of 2 people learning how to be in each other's company without losing themselves. She thought about Thomas, and about the fact that she still carried his photograph in her satchel, and that she would always carry it, and that Cole had never once suggested she shouldn't. She thought about Martha, whose memory lived in this ranch and in the way Cole sometimes went quiet at certain hours of the day, and who Agnes had come to feel not as a ghost, but as a presence she respected. The previous chapter of a life that had more than one chapter in it. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving. It didn't erase what came before it. It didn't replace the losses or justify them or make them worth it in some tidy accounting. Thomas was still gone. Martha was still gone. The years of running were still real, and the fear was still real, and the damage was still real. But here was also real. This lumber pile in the May sun. This warehouse that they had built together from the frame of one that had been destroyed. These people eating lunch in the yard with the easy familiarity of people who had chosen each other, one ordinary day at a time. Agnes had spent most of her adult life being practical about large things and strict with herself about not asking for more than was available. She had been right to be practical, and she did not regret the strictness. But she had been wrong about what was available. She had been working with a smaller inventory than the one that actually existed, and the discovery of the full inventory, late and imperfect, and arrived at in the most roundabout way imaginable, was not less real for any of that. In June, Cole asked her to marry him. He did it the way he did most things, without ceremony, without having planned the exact moment in advance, at the kitchen table after supper when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the lamp was burning between them, and they had been talking about the summer cattle count. He said, "I think we should make this formal." She looked at him. "Not because of the agreement," he said. "Not because it's practical, though it is. Because I want to. Because you are—" He stopped. He was not a man who found these sentences easy, and she knew it, and she waited while he found the words. "Because you are the most genuinely capable person I have met in my life. And I have been watching you for 8 months apply that capability to everything except asking for what you want, and I want to be what you want. If that's something you can say." Agnes looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter that had started all of this. The forged thing, the false promise, the impossible beginning. She thought about how she had held it on the bench at the station, knowing it was wrong, but not yet knowing how wrong, or what wrong would turn into. "Cole," she said. "Yes. I want you to know that I am not saying yes because I arrived here under complicated circumstances and don't have anywhere else to go." "I know that," he said, "and I'm not saying yes because you defended me and housed me and stood next to me through a very difficult 2 months. I know that too. I'm saying yes," she said, "because when I wake up in this house, I'm glad to be here, specifically and concretely glad. And when I think about waking up somewhere else, I find I have no interest in it at all." She held his eyes. "That is the only reason that matters. Is that enough?" "That's more than enough," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand, the one with the scar from the fire now, the white line across the back of it that would be there permanently. She had cleaned that wound and wrapped it and changed the dressing 4 times, and she knew the exact shape of it. "Yes," she said. They married in July at the Red Pine Crossing Courthouse because it was the sensible location and neither of them had an interest in production. Alderman served as a witness. Walter Briggs served as the other witness and wept quietly throughout, which he would deny until his dying day, and which everyone present would remember with affection. Clara Sutton brought a cake she had made herself to the small gathering afterward at the ranch. Lemon, which nobody had requested and which turned out to be exactly right. Dillard made a toast that started well and ran long. Fos said nothing but sat at the table with his cup and the particular expression that was, Agnes had learned, his version of contentment. Martinez shook Cole's hand and kissed Agnes on the cheek, which surprised her and pleased her equally. The photograph of Thomas sat on the small shelf in the room that was now fully Agnes's, not the room off the kitchen anymore, but the larger room, the one with the window that faced east, that caught the morning light first. She had put it there when she moved her things, and Cole had seen it and said nothing except that it was a good spot for it, which was precisely the right thing to say. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the next year. the spring calving numbers, the water rights case, which had proceeded through the county assessor and was close to a formal resolution that would benefit Platt and the two smaller ranchers. The warehouse, which was already being used as intended, and which still smelled of new wood in the warm days. Edmund Carr wrote from Columbus in August to say that the fraud case had been taken up formally, that two other plaintiffs had joined, and that Vincent Holloway's lawyer had filed for a continuance that had been denied. Carr expected a trial date before the year was out. Agnes wrote back to thank him and included payment for his time that was more than he'd asked for and less than he deserved, and she said so. And he wrote back to say that some cases were their own compensation, and he was glad of the outcome, and he hoped life in Montana suited her. She wrote, "It does. More than I expected," which was a great deal more than I expected to be able to say. She sat at the kitchen table in the August evening with the window open and the warm air coming in from the yard and Cole at the other end of the table going through the cattle ledger, and she folded the letter and thought about what she would tell someone, if someone asked her, about how you ended up somewhere good after a long time somewhere difficult. She would tell them, she thought, that it was not one decision. People wanted it to be one decision. The moment you chose to be brave, the morning you got up and changed everything. But it wasn't one decision. It was the accumulation of small ones, often made tired, often made without knowing if they were right, staying on the bench in the cold instead of accepting the first offer to leave, trusting a man she didn't know because his face was honest, making biscuits in the dark before anyone was up because her hands needed something to do, asking the right question in a rancher's meeting, putting everything on the table in a kitchen in the middle of the night because honesty was the only currency she had left, and she had decided to spend it. None of those decisions had been certain. She had not known, when she made any of them, that they were part of a path to anywhere. She had just made them, one at a time, because they were the next true thing available to her. And here, at the end of them, not the end, nothing was the end, but here at this point in the continuing story was a kitchen table in Montana with good light and the smell of the coming evening, and a man she had chosen and who had chosen her, both of them imperfect and worn and wiser than they had been, neither of them under any illusion that the road ahead would be simple. But situated, both of them, finally, situated, that was the word. That was always the word. Outside, the summer evening was long and warm, and somewhere on the east pasture the cattle were moving, and the fence that had been down since September of the year before was mended and holding, and the warehouse that had burned was rebuilt and standing, and the bench at Red Pine Crossing Station sat empty on the platform in the last of the light, waiting for whoever came next off whatever train arrived. Agnes Whitlock, Agnes Ashcroft now, though she was still getting used to the sound of it, sat at her kitchen table and did not look back. There was too much ahead worth looking at,